Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It looks like we have an official quorum now, and we might be able to bring this meeting to order. So let me start by extending afternoon greetings to everyone. My name is Jolina Grande, and I'm privileged to serve as the chairperson for the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and extend a special appreciation for the hospitality of the California Community College Chancellor's Office by hosting our meeting today. We are very thrilled to come to you live from 1102 Q Street. Today's meeting is being broadcast, and interested parties can view the broadcast by visiting the website. Let me give this to you for anyone that might want to log in. http://cde.videossc.com. But I know that I say it rather fast and might not fully enunciate my words, so the link can also be found on the committee's webpage. I have been told that we have a number of special guests with us today, one of whom is Karen Staff-Walters, the Executive Director for the State Board of Education. Thank you so much for joining us today. And since we do indeed have a quorum with 4 members in attendance, I will call this meeting to order at 12:12 p.m. and welcome Alma Salazar from the Los Angeles Area Chamber of Commerce, who is attending in absence of David Rattry. I would also like to welcome Kristen McGuire from Young Invincibles as our new ex officio member. Welcome. Would you like to share a little about yourself and the work you're involved with the Young Invincibles?
Sure. I'm the Western Region Director for Young Invincibles, which is a national policy and advocacy group for young adults. We work on issues that pertain to healthcare, workforce, and higher education across the country.
Thank you so much for joining us. All right. Are we ready to get started on the agenda? If so, I'd like to ask for approval of the meeting minutes from January 11th. Is there a motion? I'd love to entertain one to approve the meeting minutes for January 11th, 2019.
I'll move.
Thank you. And is there a second to the motion?
I can second that.
Thank you. All right. Has everyone had a chance to review the minutes from January 11th? And are there any comments, corrections? Did we get your name spelled right?
Yes, this time, yeah.
All right. Any other comments? Comments from members of the public on the minutes? All right, we are ready to vote then. The Bagley-King Open Meeting Act requires that we vote by roll call. So our CDE staff, Lisa Reimers, you want to call the roll?
Member Costa?
Chair Grande.
Aye.
Member Fawn.
Aye.
Member Rucker.
Aye.
And Vice Chair Sun.
Aye.
The minutes of January 11th have been approved. Our meeting minutes and the recording of the broadcasts are available on the California Workforce Pathways Joint Advisory Committee webpage, so you will see them posted there, along with today's agenda. We'll begin with a review of the committee's approved guiding policy principles document and receive an update on current state initiatives, the Career Technical Education Incentive Grant, and the K-12 Strong Workforce Program. Then we'll continue working on developing the state's transition plan for the Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act. We'll just affectionately call that Perkins 5, which will take a majority of our time this afternoon. So if everyone's ready to get started, I anticipate we are going to have robust conversations on that Perkins 5 transition plan draft. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce Patricia DeCas, Deputy Executive Director from the State Board of Education. She is going to give us more information on the purpose of this committee and review not only our purpose, but introduce Donna Wyatt, who will briefly review the materials for this meeting. Patricia?
Yes, thank you so much, Chair Grande and members of the committee. It's a pleasure for me to be here again before you. I would like just to take a few minutes to explain sort of the purpose of this committee. I usually review this, but because it's the first time that we have Member McGuire with us, I'd like to just spend a few minutes to kind of retrace some of what the committee has covered in the last 2 years. So it was 2 years ago in 2017 that the committee was first reconvened, and we set out in 2017 to kind of go over a lot to get a better understanding of sort of the landscape around career technical education in California. So many things have changed in the state since the last Perkins plan was submitted to the Federal Department of Education back in 2008, that we really covered a lot of different areas. And each meeting, we held information meetings and covered a number of different areas of focus, if you will. So we covered career exploration and guidance issues, data sharing. I think we spent at least a meeting and a half on those topics, the dual enrollment issues, the system alignment, and work-based learning. We had a number of presentations over the course of 2017, and that sort of culminated and provided enough foundation for the staff of this committee to then present a guiding principles document, which you have, I think, in your packets, and we'll be discussing public feedback on that in just a bit. So the guiding principles document is really foundational for all of the work that the committee is working on. So it covers overarching principles, and this is something that Vice Chair Sun presented to the committee back in January, but for the benefit of Member McGuire, I'm going to just say a few words about it. We do have overarching guiding principles, as well as essential elements for a high-quality career technical education program. And then we also have some working norms included in that document. So it is helpful for us to signal at the state the kinds of behaviors that we expect from our local partners, local and regional partners. And so that document was approved by this committee at both the March as well as the May 2018 meetings. And then subsequent to the passage of the 2018 Budget Act, the California decided to invest in ongoing funding for career technical education, both through the CTE incentive grant program, $150 million, as well as the K-12 Strong Workforce Program, $150 million, with another $14 million dedicated for technical assistance providers for both of those programs. And so the committee then just did a pivot, if you will, and began, because one of the requirements of both of those ongoing funds is to develop some outcome metrics, which the committee embarked on through its September and November meetings, and then was finally approved in December. And I think at that time, Chair Grande, you were a participant of that meeting, and we approved those. So we have now pivoted again in 2019 just to begin the work of addressing the requirements of the new Perkins 5. And so we will, the Federal Department of Education has extended the deadline for submission to May, I understand it's May 24th. So we will be dedicating the next couple of meetings to that purpose, all the while keeping ourselves grounded in the work that the committee has already done around the guiding principles. And so I look forward to the conversations today. I think we have a full agenda, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Do we have any questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much, Patricia. Donna, welcome. Would you like to walk us through what our ambitious agenda includes today?
Absolutely. Good afternoon, committee members. Starting on the left-hand side of your folder, you will see the facilitator's agenda, and then the minutes from the Friday, January 11th meeting that you just approved. Then a yellow sheet, which are the guiding policy principles, the essential elements of high-quality college and career pathways, and then also the norms. And then the 3 items for today. Item number 1, which is the public feedback on the guiding policy principles. Item number 2, which is an update on the state initiatives, the CTE incentive grant, as well as the K-12 Strong Workforce Program. And on that item, Michelle McIntosh was going to present CTEIG for you. She got pulled into a meeting, so I'm going to pitch hit on that one with Dr. Roberts. So, and then item 3 is the transition plan, the 2019-2020 transition plan for the new Perkins 5. On the right-hand side are the documents that pertain just to item 3, the transition plan, the PowerPoint, as well as the actual draft of the transition plan, and then the feedback guide that our colleagues from WestEd are going to walk you through today. And that's it.
Thank you so much, Donna. All right. I have just been informed we have another special guest in attendance today, probably because we're here at the Chancellor's office. Shani Weber was able to join us. She is our new Vice Chancellor for Economic and Workforce Development, I believe is the full elongated title. Am I missing a component part of it? Workforce and Economic Development. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to the Chancellor's office. All right, I am going to introduce someone who needs no introduction. Lisa Reimers, Education Programs Consultant from the California Department of Education, is going to provide a summary of public feedback that has been received on the guiding principles. We asked for more information after the last meeting, and we thank you so much for providing it for us and walking us through it. Lisa?
Thank you, and good afternoon, members. So today, my presentation is really short. At the last meeting, you asked for the specific comments that were submitted to us for feedback. Again, I have a slide. It just shows we've had 46 responses. One of those responses was spam, so we really only have 45 responses. It was somebody advertising their yes, their album, their country music album. So, so we have 46 responses. Yes, it's a good career, music. So we have 46 responses. 45 are shown on the large document that I gave you. Again, here are the common themes. They want more about elementary, middle, and adult programs, more inclusion of business and industry voice, more emphasis on the student voice, and issues around competitive funding. And they really are concerned on how this is going to look like for the locals. How is it going to be measured? They have a lot of concerns around data, which are similar concerns that have been brought up in our advisory over the past year and a half. So like I said, what you have are the actual detailed comments, and it is up to you members what you want us to do with that after today's meeting.
So, Member Fawn.
I wonder if you can give us a highlight of some of the comments that you think will actually can stand out.
Highlight, what's the best way to do this? I would just go back to the slide with the common themes, because those, the reason why we're pulled them out as common themes is because they came up repetitively from multiple commenters. So when looking at all the responses, these were definitely highlighted as the main issues for the public.
Lisa, when it comes to some of the comments that were actually questions, did we have any sort of like a document that was drafted that addressed the questions that were presented by the comments?
All we've done at this time is we've consolidated all the comments, and we have shared comments with the Perkins team and our team as well, because there were a lot of comments that were directly targeted towards like the Perkins or the Strong Workforce Program. And so those comments we're sharing to those people so they can address them. They don't really talk about our principles, but we wanted to make sure that their voice was captured and that we're sharing it to the proper people.
Thank you. Member Rucker?
Well, there are some comments making some requests for editing or even expanding some of the content, and some of the commenters also talked about the use of some megaterms, particularly in the preamble, and they felt that those megaterms don't make clear the direction or the broad strokes of what the work is that's in front of this particular panel. So my question is, having received and seen these comments, what is it that we should be charged to do in responding to some of these very pointed comments about editing or even revising some of the statements in the guiding principles?
That's really up to you guys as the board.
I didn't mean to ask you of that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So I think, and Chair Grande, let me know if you feel this is not appropriate, but if we've asked for public feedback, they've given us some comments that have been summarized into common themes. I think then it would be just to revisit, without impending, the principles to see where there needs to be greater accentuation of certain items. It also seemed to me, based on the comments that were provided, or maybe in future as this begins to roll out in terms of measures and metrics, that there be greater clarification, because many of the comments seem to revolve around how is this going to be implemented, or what are the built-in expectations, if that makes sense. So ensuring that whatever themes are appropriate to be incorporated as it relates to a larger principal theme, right? So keeping it high level, but also with being forward-looking as it relates to clarification or greater guidance as this continues to roll out.
It's interesting that you should make that comment, because it was very similar to a conversation that we had at the last meeting in terms of the living, breathing nature of the guiding policies and principles document being subject to refinement as we go along. And I think to Member Rucker's comment, it would be incumbent upon us to look at these comments and make sure that we have as much clarity as possible as we embrace wholeheartedly those guiding policy principle documents. Any other comments? Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, just, I appreciate the comments that, and the detail with which some of these comments were from the public on this, and I feel like our guiding principles and the work that we're doing here is very much valued and is under a lot of scrutiny as well, which is good. The themes that I'm seeing that has come out here, I'm not sure that we can necessarily address them in the guiding principles. It is going to be around the plan. And I think what we may be, we need to do very quickly is to move into how we actually operationalize these guidelines. And once we do that, then I think a lot of the questions that have come out will help, it will help answer some of those questions. So as we're looking at the next item and going through the transition plan and how we will eventually develop the Perkins application, I'd like for us to get ahead of this a little bit and really come up with what are the operational tenets of this? Is it professional development? Is it a focus on regional collaboration? What are some of the nuts and bolts that we want to prioritize in actualizing these principles?
Member Fawn?
I wish to echo that comment there. And I think I made this point at the last meeting. And as I was reviewing these comments, for me, I guess it's just the nature of my eyes. My eyes are attracted to those comments that pertain to collaboration, communication,
Yes.
Facilitation, alignment. And you have up here, the first theme is more inclusivity for elementary schools, middle schools, and adult education. And I'm not sure about the word adult education because it contains some definition, if you will, that may be appropriate or not appropriate. But I think if we were to embark or move toward developing a plan, that needs to be captured, the points that I just made there in collaboration across segments and that horizontal communication between the K-12 and the community colleges and probably beyond. And I specifically want to see that.
Any other comments? This was what we asked for at the last meeting, so it gives us plenty of direction with what our allies in the field have looked at, seen, and found important to note. So it would be good for all of us to go back and take a look at the comments if we haven't had a chance to read them and scrutinize them as much as possible, so that we can ensure that our guiding principles document does indeed address as many of them as possible. Vice Chair?
Yeah, I could just ask, did staff find anything based on the comments that would warrant us making some tweaks to the current wording?
There were some comments that had specific little wordsmithing things that may or may not, I don't know if it changes the message, little grammatical types of things.
Okay.
Looking at the comments, and I've gone through them quite a few times now, I haven't seen anything alarming. I see a lot of concern from the field about funding, competitiveness with the funding. I'm seeing implementation. I'm seeing a lot of people say, oh yeah, these are really lofty goals. How are we going to get there? So that's what I really read.
Okay. So what I would just suggest is there's nothing substantive. If there are a few little tweaks where it's grammatical or a word here and there, that staff come back to us with those pieces, and then we move forward with the implementation and working on the plan. And then if we see that as we're working on that we need to go back, we could always go back and tweak something more substantive at that point. That would just be my suggestion moving forward.
With our draft guidelines being our approved guidelines, I'm always very hesitant until we've seen them operationalized to make significant changes to them. So I'm in alignment with Vice Chair Sun that if there's small grammatical tweaks that could be made, but until we actually see them in action, we're not quite sure what it's going to look like yet. So I can't wait till agenda item 3, that transition plan draft. I'm looking forward to how it's going to instruct using and operationalizing the guiding principles.
I do want to underscore, though, that I think it was reflected in the comments more so than not, that those that commented did agree with the direction in which we're heading. So I think it's important to state that I think in many ways this committee has encapsulated what folks hope to see in terms of broad overarching tenets.
That's an important point to note. Yes, please.
Hi.
Welcome,
Hi.
Amy Costa.
Sorry, I'm late. There was only one theme, though, that I found a little bit troublesome, and that is the lack of student voice. That was one of the themes staff has identified as a theme. And I agree, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but honestly, at the end of the day, if we don't have the student voice incorporated, I'm not really sure sort of what the purpose of the document is. And so that is something that I think that we should look at more, because it definitely reads not as a student-centered document. And I think although it will evolve and change as we put it forward, that is the most important part of this document and our work ahead of us.
So do you have suggestions for areas?
I mean, I think some of it is even just verb tense, to be honest with you. It's like we're talking about it in a programmatic level instead of talking about it from the student experience level, which is, when we say that we want to align the curriculum, what we're really talking about is increasing opportunities for students through that alignment. And so I don't necessarily think that the idea is wrong. It's that we're talking about it more from a programmatic sense versus a student outcome sense. And so it's things like that. Because the rest of them I agree, as we operationalize it, I think we would tweak it slightly, but it's troublesome to me that came forward as a theme of the document. That's a pretty big area that I think needs to be addressed. And so I don't know if it's appropriate if staff wants to take a stab at kind of including some more student-focused language. Again, I don't think that the concepts are wrong. It's just maybe how we're phrasing it and backing into it more of what this would mean for the students if we're successful.
So would it be more along the lines of like a vision statement before the preamble?
I think it's more actually baked within the content of the document itself, to be honest with you. And like I said, it might just be that we write it in a way in which the perspective that we're emphasizing is slightly different. And in some areas, it's already there. I mean, we actually, ironically enough, have a focus on student-centered delivery of services. I just think that the way the document is reading is not necessarily student-focused.
I mean, I will say that we did have a lot of conversations in the last year and a half around students and what that looks like for students as they're moving their way through the pathway. So I don't think we did it out of isolation of consideration of students. And if there are suggestions for making some tweaks, I think that would be great to do that. If there are areas that you're finding, if perhaps provide to staff would be great.
Well, I would just note it's a theme in the public comments as well, so it's not just
Yeah.
my personal
Right.
thought on it. And I'd be happy to draft up some edits and provide them to Lisa.
Oh, that's very kind of you, especially considering that the student is who's going to benefit from career education, but it's also the student who we need to entice into career education, because the messaging may not be clear that career education is a viable option as they're thinking and developing a mindset of I've got to go to the university or I've got to go immediately to college, and they're forgetting about the opportunity that career education in colleges have and the ability to generate the beginning of that pathway while they're still in secondary education. Thank you, Amy.
Thanks.
Any other comments? No others? I want to thank you again, Lisa, for putting them all together, because it did answer the query that we have, and now it's provided much more for us to have a dialogue about and make sure that not only are we addressing the comments that were solicited, but that we answer the questions that they pose in one way, shape, or form. So thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. All right. Our next agenda item is the California Career Technical Education Initiatives, an update on the Career Technical Education Incentive Grant, as well as the K-12 Strong Workforce Program. And I see that Donna Wyatt is back. We appreciate you pitch hitting for Michelle McIntosh, who is unable to join us. She is the Education Administrator for the Career Technical Education Leadership Office at the California Department of Ed. But we are very, very fortunate that Donna Wyatt and Matt Roberts will be giving us an update on these two initiatives, the Career Technical Education Incentive Grant, CTEIG, as well as the K-12 Strong Workforce Program. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Donna and Matt.
Thank you very much. So this will be, again, a very short presentation just to update you on the two initiatives and where we are. Make sure I'm progressing here. No. There we go. So with the CTE incentive grant, $150 million ongoing funding, the request for applications went out on December 19th and had to be submitted to the CDE by 5 o'clock on the 25th. We received 378 applications total. 42 of those applications were not eligible. They didn't complete the application or they weren't eligible entities for the funding. The total amount requested was 352, so double the amount that is available. And at the state board meeting in March, the allocations will be presented. And the purpose of that has always been to avoid, for districts to hopefully avoid March 15th notices, so they will at least know what their allocations are.
I just have a question. I was looking at the information that you provided on the slide versus the information provided in the agenda item, and I was just wondering, in the agenda item, it indicated that CDE received 364 applications, but on the slide, 378. Does that add to the number that was not eligible, or was it just an updated number?
My thinking was probably an updated. It was when the applications came in on the 25th, it was a rush to try to get everything counted and determine who was eligible, who wasn't, so, yes.
And of the 42 applications that were not eligible, what was the primary disqualifier, if you happen to know?
There were two parts to the application, so in most of them, they didn't complete both parts of the application, and then with some of them, they were elementary districts, or they were adult charter schools, and they are not eligible for the funding. CTEIG specifically says grades 7 through 12. So, but generally, most of it was they just didn't submit a complete application.
Had there been previous workshops or professional development activities coaching them on how to complete the application correctly?
Yes, we conducted a webinar, and then also our education program consultants were supporting the field with their applications.
And for those that were not eligible because they didn't have complete applications, was any feedback provided to them that would make their application in the future complete so that they would be viable candidates going forward?
Yes, letters were submitted to them about why they didn't, why they weren't eligible and what they needed to do in the future, because again, it is $150 million ongoing. So they might not get funded this time, but they would be eligible for next year.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so I see that the notification of grant awards is April 30th. Can you give me an overview about what the work is going to be done between the deadline for submission and the notification of awards? Because that's, you actually have given yourself more time to figure out who to give the awards to than you gave to the LEAs to do the planning and collaboration that would be important for them on the other side to implement the program. So I'm very interested in knowing what it is you'll be doing with these 4 months actually, that you've given yourself to pass out these awards.
Well, the allocations will actually be made public at the state board meeting in March. So districts will know what they're getting, but they won't actually get the funds because we didn't want them using the funds ahead of time. The application was a little bit different from what are normal applications. This time we did a rubric where the LEAs that were applying had to evaluate their CTE programs against the legislation and then also the quality elements of high quality CTE, and then align their spending to cause those improvements. So it was a little bit different application, but districts will know what their allocations are. And the push for that was to, again, avoid those March 15th notices, if at all possible. So they'll at least know what they're getting, and they'll know whether they need to submit those March 15th notices to staff.
Could you give a little more detail about the criteria that's actually on the rubric and how the LEAs that applied were guided in using? Rubric is a very specific term of art for me, a former English teacher. So usually when I give students a rubric, they know this is how I'm going to be graded, and they usually write directly to that rubric. So could you give me a little bit more detail about what was actually in the rubric, and were any of the elements weighted? Is there any way that the rubric may have been because of the shortness of the timeline between when the applications were available and when they were due, does the rubric seem to favor people who previously have received these awards, or does it level the playing field for people who were first-time applicants as well? Because that would be, for me, the strength of that rubric.
The rubric looked at those elements that need to be in place before you even start a program. For example,
and those are?
For example, an advisory committee. If I'm going to start a pathway, I'm going to start a CTE program, I want an advisory committee. I want to make sure that I have those industry partners that are going to support the students and support the program. I also want to look at labor market. So even for folks that were starting new programs, there were elements that we wanted to see in place. Then it went all the way through to those programs that are essentially high-quality programs but need perhaps a little bit of support, a little bit of tweaking. So I think we balanced the rubric so that districts were able, or LEAs were able, to go on both ends. I'm starting a new program. I've got the basic elements of an advisory. I've got a CTE teacher in place. I've proven that there's labor market for that program, all the way to programs that are well established and perhaps want to expand or offer more programs to more students or dual enrollment. So I think we designed the rubric to span the full range of where a CTE program might be. The application started, the first phase was they had to submit basically into the program or the Perkins Grant Management System. That was the first part of the application. The second part was the rubric. And then there also was a very brief narrative of 6 pages where they could give us the overall vision of what they were doing in the districts.
And then going back to the point that Member Costa made earlier, which, by the way, I absolutely agree with your point concerning student voice, in what way were the districts asked for data about the students who would be served in this program, and how does the rubric evaluate the match between inputs, which would be information about the students that these programs are designed for targeting, and the processes that the program itself is supposed to implement? So how does the rubric evaluate those things, and what kind of data about students were actually requested?
The data that we looked at or that we asked for was participation data, comparing it to perhaps what the school site is. Does the pathway look like the school site? Most of the data was really similar to the prior CTEIG, and it also looked at some of the data that we've normally collected under Perkins too. Who's enrolled? Does it look like the campus? Does it look like the school district as a whole? Who's participating in these pathways? And what are the openings? We looked at prerequisites. Are there prerequisites to the program? Things like that.
Okay, thank you.
So just to follow up on that, Don, of the 378 minus the 42 who had applied, how many of those were new?
That I do not know. I'd have to check with Michelle to find out.
Yeah, I was
Yes.
curious because I did feel like the timeline was very short time for new ones to come in. Yeah.
It was. And again, that was what we heard from the field is help us to avoid those March 15th notices. And that's why we put it on the fast track. So.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comments? Yes, ma'am.
I have a question, of course, on the finance part, which is, I noticed on your slide you mentioned that you received a request of approximately $352 million from those submissions, but I'm kind of wondering what's the range of scores, because clearly you had a cut score to fund these grants, and kind of what's the universe looking like as far as high-quality applications?
We are still in the process of looking at those. Again, it just closed on the 25th, so we're still processing all of that information. What are the scores? Where is it falling? Who's new? Who's a reapply? So I can get that information for you.
But that wasn't the question. That wasn't the question I heard.
What question do you want to pose?
Go on.
You should have a sense, though, kind of a little bit about, like, the universe. Like, are they all A pluses? Are there some C's in there? Kind of, saying that there's 352 million of requests doesn't really give you a view into how many of those are ones that you would potentially fund.
Right, right. And Michelle could probably give that to you. She's the lead on the CTIG, but unfortunately, I'm not aware of that.
Great, thanks.
Donna, will you ask Michelle possibly to provide for us an update with the number of applications, how many
Yes.
were reapplications, the type of projects? Thank you very
and
much.
a range of scores, so I can do that as soon as I'm away from the table.
Okay, thank you.
And then, again, going back to what Member Costa asked, in creating this rubric, I would have an idea that you would have at least a belief about what a cut score is, so that as a way of culling out the applications that just simply cannot or will not be considered. And as I asked earlier, on the rubric, are there elements that are weighted for consideration as a way of helping to identify or evaluate not only high-quality programs, but high-quality or high-priority issues based on what it says about the student population or the opportunity to engage or create new access or a different kind of access for students. I need to understand, we keep using the term high-quality CTE, and I'm not seeing it from the description you gave, and maybe because it is the other staff person who needs to share this with us, what exactly is that definition, and how is that definition actually crafted into the way the rubric will be used. So when we hear back, either at the board meeting for Board Member Lee-Cohn, Ting, and I, when we hear at the board meeting, we want to understand how the rubric defined the criteria for high-quality CTE and what the cut score was. Or when we come back for this convening again and have our meeting and we hear what the recommendation is going to be, I want to understand what the field believed you were defining as high-quality CTE programs so I can understand whether or not they actually wrote their programs that way. I'm going to reiterate, as Ting has already said, we were concerned about the timeline that was given to districts, particularly new applicants, for doing all of the work to create collaborative norms to do this work, not only to submit the application, but then going forward, if they're funded, to do the work going forward with their collaborating partners. So I am concerned that this does favor previously funded programs and new opportunities to create a different kind of access in programs that haven't been previously funded are not favored by the way this process, particularly the timeline, went forward. So I appreciate that you all did do some work to massage the timeline, some, because the original deadline was quite a bit earlier than the one that you submitted here. But knowing that there wasn't the funding decisions weren't going to happen until March, I still believe there could have been some more time afforded to LEAs to help with this, because from what you've described about the rubric, I am concerned that there's a very narrow profile of the types of districts that are going to be funded and an even narrower profile of the type of programs. Our goal is to broaden the diversity of not only the type of pathways that are being funded, but the types of schools and the geography of schools across the state that begin participating in these programs. Based on what I'm hearing you say right now, I'm not sure that's going to be the outcome from this funding cycle. And we need to learn from that. We need to learn from this application, from this process, because there will be a continuing process next year to do the same thing, and we need to do it better, and we need to figure out a way to be of greater assistance to the LEAs who want to participate.
To echo the comment that you just made, the report back that they provide to us at the next meeting would be very instrumental for those schools that may not have been considered eligible this time. And if they can get started working on it now, the next submission may be very beneficial. I do have one question though. Is the rubric included in the application, and was it available online? So if we were to go out and take a look at the application, would we be able to ascertain the rubric as well?
Yes, you would.
Thank you so much, Donna. I appreciate you fielding these questions on behalf of Michelle. Are there any others? Yes, ma'am.
How did we notify the LEAs about the funding opportunities?
Through the website and then also at conferences, things like that throughout the state, yes.
I just wanted to add a comment. I'm hoping that before this time in this next cycle, in next year, that we will have a much more of a solidified framework for under our guiding principles as to what the criterion should be, and that there will be consistency among all of these programs, including the Perkins, so that we don't have different criterion focusing on different, emphasizing different priorities in each of these different programs, funding sources that we have for our CTE programs. So hopefully what's going to help is the work that we're going to be doing here, and I had to go back again, repeat myself around, let's get ahead of this and work on a clear plan moving forward for the state, not for one funding source or another funding source, but statewide, what is our approach?
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I would just note that in this particular case, I think the legislation drove kind of what was going to happen. And so I agree with you in principle, but I also think that, sometimes that's not really within our control.
But with our metrics, we do have control over providing suggestion of the metrics. And that's what that's another piece that we'll be looking at, which drives the program.
Are there any other comments for Donna on CTEIG? And I want to welcome our last member who joined us. We now are in a full complement. This is amazing.
It's the first time in a while.
It is. It's very nice to see everyone here. Any further comments for Donna that she might be able to share? Okay. Thank you, Donna. Thank you. Matt?
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, Chairperson Grande and members of the advisory. Thanks for having us here. I'm Matt Roberts with the Chancellor's Office in the Workforce and Economic Development Division. And with me today is my counterpart, Alejandro Sandoval, who is really the voice of the help desk for K-12 Strong Workforce and for Strong Workforce. And so he's going to be talking to us and presenting a little bit about the NOVA platform, which he oversees. And NOVA is our application, our LOI system, and also the expenditure reporting window for LEAs in the field. So, well, without further delay, we'll jump into the PowerPoint. So this is for the K-12 Strong Workforce Program. It's for $164 million that flows through the community colleges to LEAs, benefiting 7th through 12th graders. So very similar to CTEIG. And so we're definitely looking for the counterpart conversation as we move forward. We feel that there's sort of a call out within the trailer bill and the language to further align. So we're looking forward to that. And as we're getting out in the first year, we do have an RFA process that's in process, or request for applications that are out. We have guidance. We've done webinars to sort of front load and help LEAs to understand like labor market information and what we're looking for specifically in the application. We also did another webinar on the metrics and especially in the alignment of principles, what we're looking for, trying to frame the accountability, trying to frame the outcomes that we're looking for students. And so the other thing we did is we did a third webinar on just the application itself where we went over it. We've updated and spent a lot of time on FAQs, and so and we're hearing good things in the field about it. It allows us to kind of see what the choke points are in the system, like for instance, match. Match is one of those things that we want to provide flexibility for, right? We want to make sure that if we're after integration of program, we also want integration of funding as well, or ways that the funding can sort of play with each other. So we're definitely interested in making sure that that rises to the top, and it's something that we're after. The FAQs, so what we've done is we've addressed the match piece and saying that this is the flexibility that we're after. So we appreciate kind of the dialogue that we've had with the field. The last meeting that we were here in front of you, we presented the summary report for the engagement meetings. As you recall, we did 15 across the state, representing or having about 12 to 1,300 LEAs, or probably about 75% of the 1,300. But we had a large number of folks out, and we were able to just develop questions and a bank of questions that we could use then to sort of iterate going forward. So your point in terms of making it better, ensuring that that rubric is there for folks to shoot for, but more importantly, what's the type of application that we're after? And I have to say, going into the part that we're in now, it's the biggest variable for me. It's like, because we've wrapped around, we've engaged, right? We've gone out and we've said, this is what we're looking for. Now let's see what the product looks like. Let's see what, I hate to say students, but let's see what the students, sort of look like. Let's see what the field does with it. And then let's sort of tweak it and do it from there. And it's both the ones that are maybe not hitting the mark and applications that might be well over hitting the mark. So we're interested in both sides of it. So we're really anxious to continue the conversation that we've enjoyed with our K-12 audience. And certainly working with the agency has been great in terms of aligning the messages going forward. So I feel like the synchronicity, the simpatico that we're looking for, if such a word, that it's definitely in development. I also wanted to say that one big part of the K-12 Strong Workforce Program is the selection committee. We've gone through a pretty rigorous process within each of the regions, and there's 7 regions throughout the state. And these are not necessarily community college regions, they're the regions that will help support K-12 Strong Workforce. And out of these folks, out of these meetings and regions, emerged a set of recommendations for who's going to be on the selection committee. And I have to tell you, I know I sat with Donna the other night and went through some of the folks that were on there. what a great cross-section of folks in the field. Maybe you can jibe with me on that one. In terms of the types and representation that we're getting and the interest that we're getting from the field, the thoughtfulness to be on the selection committee, to sort of have that conversation. Because the next step is identify the folks that are going to be looking at applications, wrap around them, make sure that they know what the priorities are, right? Make sure that they can, this body of folks can pivot and have a conversation that gets into things like duplication within a region. Things that are very big picture, that are transformational, and things that can really move the system forward. So we're really interested in next steps with the selection committee. We'll start to convene those. An announcement will go out to the field on Friday as expected on who those are. We'll message it out to the regions. Folks will get notified. We have alternates that are on there too. So, I mean, it's a really well-structured. Part of what we'll show you today too is there is and we may be able to show you, we're still in an RFA process, so we don't want to blow our competitive edge here. Sorry, so kick me if I do, before I do, rather. We do have a review process or a review module that's within the NOVA system. And what it'll allow folks to do is to independently score the applications as they come in using a rubric and then score it. And then folks convene to talk about ones that maybe have hit above a cut mark. So normally when we run RFAs, we say you have to have a score of at least 75, right? And so we use a cut point. The ones that don't rise above the 75, we're going to really get out and message them so that they can get funding into next year. What will happen next year too is we'll ask the question, is this building upon your metrics? Have you achieved outcomes with this? Can it something that we can reinvest in to sort of move it forward? That's the type of I think, pinpoint accuracy that we're looking for to sort of guide the investments that are out there. So we do have on our minds the outcomes, the metrics, the input. Put it this way, when we'll do an awarding of the grants. So the applications are due March 15th, so pretty quick. And we'll notify folks by April 30. So that gives us roughly 45 days to score them, to work with it, and then to message it out. It's going to be a really great day, I think, for us in the state in terms of operationalizing two great programs together. So we will get notifications out to the field by April 30th. The field is aware of that timeline. We feel as if we've messaged that pretty well. So I won't go into too much about applicants, even though I want to, because it's the questions that you're asking, the answers to those are things that we want to take from the application, the NOVA system, and actually put it on an analytic so that folks can see sort of what those outcomes look like. Who are the types of folks that are coming in? What are the investments? What size of LEA are they? Are we making sure that we're reaching the rural areas? Are we making sure that we're reaching the folks that target students that have a higher than average dropout rate in the state? So when you ask the question about students, we actually took the rubric and we pumped up the amount of points that you can get in the student selection area, because that's who we want to prioritize. We want folks to see that that's worth a few extra points in order to make sure that you're targeting the right students, right? So I think we've been somewhat thoughtful on it in the really short ramp up that we've done. And again, I want to thank Donna and her team. I wanted to take a couple of minutes and kind of show you NOVA, if that's okay, but shall I stop for questions, Chairperson?
Let's see if there's any questions while we're looking to the transition.
Okay, very good.
Any questions for?
It's moving along nicely. We'll be able to share more once March 15 goes by, but I'll be excited to share with you.
Well, I just wanted to compliment the work that you've done. The work in putting together this RFA process has matured from when we first started discussing what this was going to look like. And so I really do appreciate the work that you've done, particularly from your office, to work closer with the field and to try to accommodate not only the need for the work that they have to do on their timelines, but also to figure out how to give them guidance to make the application process something that both the applicants as well as the funders from your office can learn from. So I'm looking forward to seeing the report on the metrics when you're ready to do that. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad you're pleased.
Any other comments? Well, let's take a look at NOVA.
Absolutely. I want to queue up, again, my colleague Alejandro Sandoval.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, Chairperson, members of the board. My name is Alejandro Sandoval. I'm with the Workforce and Economic Development Division. I'll give you a brief overview about NOVA, other than some random word that we just threw at you. So NOVA is actually a system that we think is a common sense approach to plan, invest, and track dollars and student outcomes. So right now, NOVA stands at 4,000 users. It came into inception in 2016. And we have programs that tally up to $1.7 billion. That's going to be the first little overview. I'm just going to show you how the actual application looks like and what funds are currently in the system. And then I'm going to walk you through some of the mock-ups from the letter of intent that we created that was due February 15th, so this past Friday. They just submitted their letter of intent. Once somebody submits a letter of intent, that's when they can create the application. I won't walk you through the application due to the competitive process right now, but I will give you the letter of intent overview, just to give you a feel of how the workflow is for the field. With that said, if you could put the screen on, please. So this is NOVA. You go to nova.cccco.edu as a domain. A user would go to their email and password. There's a sign-up link for K-12 where they'd enter all their information and then see what their lead partner LEA is, and then start their letter of intent. If they don't know their password,
He forgot his password.
yeah. So once a user logs in, by the first placement, you have read-only access, and then you get specific role access. So everything is role-based. So if I work for the Strong Workforce program, specifically, I can see all the other programs in NOVA as a read-level access, but if I also work for Adult Education Block Grant, I can see that role in my profile, and I can have access to that information, edit whatever plans as well. On the breadcrumbs to the left, you'll see that you have bookmarks, you have the current programs. So like I mentioned, we have Adult Education Block Grant, Guided Pathways, Integrated Plan, K-12 Strong Workforce Program, Local Vision Goals, Strong Workforce Program Local Share, and Strong Workforce Program Regional Share. And each one has their own sub-menu. So Local Share, you have your projects. We have fiscal reporting modules for each one, which is going to also be built in for the Strong Workforce Program K-12. We have analytics for each different fund. And the end goal is that once we have all the funds from the Chancellor's Office, you'd actually be able to have that braided funding and braided idea of where these dollars are going and how we're expending these dollars, so we don't expend the same dollar twice. So that's the overview of NOVA. I'll do a letter of intent workflow. So somebody would go to K-12 SVP and go to letter of intent and create a letter of intent. Here's the mock-up prototype. So we give them a brief overview, getting started. So welcome to the letter of intent. The following education agencies are eligible for the Strong Workforce Program funding, and then it gives the list of eligible LEAs. And it has a little information, the time frame when it's going to be submitted. You go to create a new LOI. You would put your pathway improvement name. So some people could put in advanced manufacturing, for example, and then you would select who the lead LEA is going to be for that letter of intent. So this is what it looks like when you actually are creating the letter of intent. So as I said, for this one, the pathway improvement name is the 3D Makerspace Training and Education. You enter the scope of the pathway improvement, the estimated total budget, and then we did a crosswalk of the California Department of Education sectors with the California Community Colleges sectors. So once you select the California Department of Education sector, it will already populate the crosswalk sector for the California Community Colleges. The next card here, we have the population focus. So who are the students that you're going to be targeting? For this one, we have all students populations. You can select continuation, independent study, special needs, or other alternative. We also ask if you aligned it with the LCAP. So is this project going to align with your 1819 LCAP? Some strategies of pathway improvement. You can add 3 by default, but you can add multiple strategies. So you give a description of 3 to 5 strategies for that. And then the user goes through these different breadcrumbs. So they went through the details, they completed that. They go to the lead agency, add who the lead agency is. We have ADA pre-populated here for the letter of intent, but then you're going to be able to kind of select the exact schools that are going to be participating in the actual application. You added the lead contact information, and then you would go to partner agencies and add your partner agencies, preview and submit, and you submit the application. If Matt, I'll pass it over to Matt, Dr. Roberts, if he has any more information that he wants to provide.
Yeah, I would say the letter of intent was due on February 15th, and it's designed to sort of give us a pre-look at what people are thinking. What do folks want to do? We didn't put any restrictions on stuff. The LCAP alignment will align to 1920 because there's no way you can get it, expect it to get it in 1819. But the idea is there. I mean, that's one of the stable points where if you plug in the program and make sure that it's in the LCAP, then there's a likelihood it'll get sustained. So I think that we do have some analytics summary analytics on the LOIs. We're not quite prepared to share those with you today, but I would like to send those out to you just so that you know this is kind of the dollar amounts folks are asking for. We'll break it down by region. There was an abundance of LOIs in the system as we moved it forward. So we also want to look more at the types of students that they're targeting. We also want to know about partners. Who are your partners? What's your ecosystem that you're building? And how can we sort of help to connect that ecosystem? So the LOI process we were happy about. You have to have an LOI to make an application. And the system's it's fairly intuitive in that once you start the application, it automatically populates it from some of the information that's in the LOI. You can change it from there, so we can wrap around folks to make sure that we don't want to go too deep into this. We just wanted to show you that this is a system that once the data comes in, as long as we work really, really hard on the definitions of them. And so to make sure that what we're getting, we can then transition into something that's useful for the field. So, and for you as well.
Are there comments or questions for Member Fawn?
No, I just want to applaud you for the system that you've set up for this application. I think this is the first that I see in terms of NOVA being implemented to basically having an analytic screen, if you will, the applications, thereby having it as objective as possible. And your strategy to include an LOI with a deadline so that, because if I'm not mistaken, this is one of the few times where the CCCO is administering a grant that is being primarily given to LEAs. And in order for the partnership to be successful, that partnership has to be formed pretty early on. And the LOI, I think, pushes that process. So I think I wholeheartedly applaud the process and the thinking that has gone into developing the process for this grant. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fan.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so super cool. I'm looking forward to seeing the data and the analytics that come in. I'm curious how much and what you're collecting aligns with what the Department of Education is collecting with, the CTEIG grants. And because I think for us to talk about system alignment and to talk about prioritization and whether it would be great to see how many LEAs applied to both grants.
Right.
What do they look like? What did their applications look very similar or they're very different? Did some get chosen for one versus the other? So those are things I think would help illustrate for us currently what we need to do, how much is aligned already, and then how much we further need to do.
That's a great idea. Yeah, absolutely. We're completely on board with that. Yep, absolutely.
Especially for the braiding of resources, it would be really good to have. That would be amazing.
You have to know, you have to do an inventory of it before you can actually, before you can actually see what the effects are and whether the effects have anything to do with what you're trying to do as well, or are you just randomly moving students?
So in this cycle, are you having conversations with the department on that? And
we are. You know what? We realized, I think we sat down a week or two ago, and it was very recent, and we said, we need to really probably align the rubric. Because honestly, I think the rubric is a function of the, I know, the rubric is a function of the legislation to a certain extent. And so I think getting it out, but when we looked at it, they're very similar. So I think that, which tells me that the legislation is too. So I think that's our next step. And I think that'll go along too. It's how do we clarify the type of applicant, the type of, pathway improvement that we're doing. It's a very good point. Thank you.
And speaking along the lines of alignment,
Mike?
to the extent that there is also an opportunity to coordinate around employer engagement.
Yeah.
So that there is connectivity, so we're not, in an effort to engage employers, we're not in the process also creating employer fatigue because we're engaging them in multiple modalities.
Point well made. It's a lot of the sector. Sorry. Thank you.
Any other comments or questions on our strong workforce K-12?
Appreciate all your work on the principals. I think they're really doing a great job guiding us. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. And again, thanks to Donna for stepping in for Michelle McIntosh. We need to move to a break to fix some technical issues that are occurring. So I am going to say we are in recess. It is 1:16. I am hoping we be able to reconvene maybe real close to 1:30, about 14 minutes. We stand in recess. Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it is now officially 1:33, and I think we can reconvene our meeting. We have one last agenda item, which makes it seem as though this meeting is almost over, but no. We are going to be looking through the draft of the 2019-20 Transition Plan for the Federal Strengthening Career and Technical Education for the 21st Century Act. Perkins 5 is what I'll affectionately call it. But before we begin our discussion on the Perkins 5 Transition Plan, which will be led by Heather Mattson from the California Comprehensive Center at West Ed, I would like to ask Tom Adams, Deputy Superintendent from the California Department of Ed, to provide some information on the submission of the state plan to the United States Department of Ed. And then Tom will go ahead and introduce Heather Mattson, who's going to facilitate our discussion on the transition plan. But before we get to Heather, Tom, what you got for us?
Yeah, thank you. Tom Adams, California Department of Education, and Donna Wyatt will join me to do a couple of updates on the Perkins status. Perkins 5, by the way, how does a Roman order anything in 5? So, sorry. That's the geeky historian in me coming out. First of all, thank you, and thank you, Kristen McGuire, for joining us as a young invincible. Let me introduce myself as an old vulnerable. On the Perkins transition plan here, first of all, I want you to realize that this is an initial iteration, an attempt to kind of respond to federal requirements as well as taking your input. And what we have in there is probably our best, but not certainly an imperfect understanding of things. And so we really look to today as an important input session on this transition plan for a number of reasons. This will be important in terms of us securing funding during this transition time, as well as getting a better sense of your thinking, so it also makes its way into the Perkins 5 plan. That is one of the reasons why we did have our friends at West Ed Comprehensive Center come over and facilitate this part today in order to kind of feel like, one, you as a committee and as individuals in this committee could do so in a manner that's, shall we say, a bit more relaxed and more about sharing your good thoughts with us. So I think in the spirit of continuous improvement, that's how we've structured this afternoon. Also, I just want to say that you might want to think about your comments in 3 different categories. When I was the executive director in the Instructional Quality Commission,
when we would march through documents like this. You want to think about it this way. Are your comments strategic in terms of, are they bringing things more into focus that aren't there in the foreground and you think they need to be? Are your comments pure content in the sense that here's an important point we need to elaborate on? Or are your comments improvements? You know, it's there, but you know, maybe with a turn of a phrase here and there, as was discussed earlier about the student voice. So think about it that way, and that might help in the facilitation of this. Okay, yeah, this is pretty good effects. I'll have to sign you up for my band. Also, just to let you know, before I hand the microphone over to Donna Wyatt, this is her last meeting with us. She's definitely moving on. She's approached this work with dedication and passion and helped me enrich my understanding of career technical education. Definitely one of the most dedicated professionals on career technical education. And so we're really lucky that she's here today giving us her last assist in this process. Just to let you know, I do have additional folks helping fulfill this. We brought back as a retired annuitant, Russ Weichel, who used to be in charge of the Career and College Transition Division. But definitely, before we move on, can we just give Donna a big hand for all she's done? So here to provide an update on Perkins.
So just the outcome for today, what we're hoping for from the advisory committee is to seek some improvement, as Tom talked about, guidance, information, questions, to improve the draft for the 2019-2020 transition plan. As we wrote the transition plan, we used the guiding policy principles, the essential elements that the committee put forward as a draft. We also tried to bring in some California context that was a little difficult because we weren't asked at this point to provide a vision for career tech ed in California. So in the program of study section, you will see some California context, some things that have occurred in California over the last 10 years. So that's really the outcome for today, is to improve the transition plan in preparation for its submission in May. The guide for the submission of the state plan, just to remind you, the original draft was released on October 24th. It had a 60-day comment period. That ended on December 24th of 2018. Then a second draft was just released on February 7th, and it incorporated some of those changes from the public comment section. The second draft also has a 30-day comment period. That will end on March 7th. And then OCTAE, the feds, are telling us that we should have a final guidance document by mid-April. January 11th, we did our first review of the 3 narratives required in the transition plan, which are the programs and programs of study, meeting the needs of special populations, and then fiscal responsibility. That, along with budget and the assurances, are the only thing that's required of the transition plan. And it should be noted, too, one of the changes that they made, that OCTAE made, was, if you remember, there was a requirement for the governor's office to review the transition plan. That actually was not in the legislation, so they removed that requirement. So,
okay.
And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather Matson to facilitate the conversation.
Thank you, Tom and Donna. And while Heather gets situated, I just wanted to let all of the members know that I've asked Heather, and she has agreed to facilitate this discussion for efficiency, so you will not have to look to me to be recognized before asking questions. We can all just keep lobbing them at Heather, and she will answer them as expeditiously as possible. But we want to thank you very much for being here and helping us through this draft and the initial conversation.
Great. Thanks, Chair Grande, members of the committee. It's nice to be here. And yes, as Chair Grande said, I'm a senior research associate with the California Comprehensive Center at West Ed. And just for those of you who aren't familiar with comprehensive centers, We are federally funded technical assistance centers that are charged with extending the capacity of state education agencies. And we have, for the last few months, been supporting the planning committee that supports this committee. And the committee decided it would be useful for all of the members, including Chair Grande, to be able to participate fully, so I'll be facilitating, and also for Jeff and Donna to be able to listen to your comments really clearly rather than having to try and facilitate. I will say that when there are direct questions, Jeff and Donna will jump in, but if there are just feedback comments, we'll be just taking notes and I'll be moving us through. So the document we're going to be using today is in your packet. It's called the feedback guide. It looks like this. And just seeing if maybe we could get the PowerPoints up. Perfect. So I think, first of all, very hard act to follow Tom Adams with the jokes. I'm going to do my best. But I think he made some great points about what kind of contributions we'll be looking for. Here are some other points. Tone, clarity, connection to state vision and priorities for career technical ed. Always with our responses to federal plans. For those of you who are really in-depth in the ESSA plan, you know we're trying to do our best to answer the questions and meet those requirements and not go too far above and beyond what's being asked of us, so that we don't overpromise where we don't need to. We can be really clear in the state about where we're headed, but we don't need to be overly explicit in the plan itself submitted to the Fed. So that's kind of the balance we're going for here. And as we walk through the draft plan, we'll be looking, after each response, we'll be looking for strengths, gaps, questions, and recommendations. So you can see the way the guide is set up is the question, the response, and then we've got a little chart here that gives you some space to take some notes. So the plan is for each response. Again, these responses vary in length, so I'll be trying to sort of monitor as we go, but we have about 3 hours. Don't worry, we're going to take another break, so we'll have there's a lot of heavy cognitive work here that we're going to jump into, but we have about 3 hours here. So the plan is about, I know you all have had a little time to review the plan in advance, but we know it didn't come to you too far in advance, so we're going to take about 5 minutes just to remind yourself and jot down some notes, ideally in the chart. We will be collecting these at the end. And then about 5 minutes or so for conversation after each. Some questions or some responses are much longer than others. So if I get a sense that you need longer time, I'll give you longer time. If there's one that we can kind of get through quickly, you can give me the eye, like we're ready, and we'll move on from there. I think those are all my pre-notes. Questions about the process before we begin? Okay, so I'm going to, for the most part, try and use my handy-dandy timer on my phone here as hopefully a gentle reminder. And I'm going to just prompt us so we know where we are. Some of those are going to be pretty small, but you can see them on your feedback guide about where we are. So we're going to jump into the first response, which is the lengthiest on programs of study. So I'm going to give us about a solid 5 minutes on this one because it is a long one for you to review and take some notes, and then I'll facilitate the conversation after. about 30 more seconds if that works. Okay. Just a couple more notes on process. If you've already made notes on the plan in advance, we're happy to also collect that in addition to the feedback guide. And we have a rather quick turnaround time to the next meeting. So if you have additional comments after today, we're asking that you get them to staff by the end of the day tomorrow. And then just last thing, I think in the interest of time, I won't go through and ask strengths, gaps, questions. I'll just call on members for comments, and I'm assuming they'll be somewhere in those general categories. So, yes, Member Ortiz-Lacon.
Yeah, just as a point of clarification, are we hoping to approve this during the March meeting or May? Because somebody just noted that we need an approved plan by mid-April, which means that we would have to have it approved by March. Is that correct? Is that when we're looking, this will come before the state board, March?
I'm looking at
for the March
Patricia.
meeting?
Okay, so we have a series of meetings scheduled for this joint advisory committee, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've polled your availability. So our next meeting will be March 11th, Monday, March 11th. We also have a meeting scheduled in April, and we also have a meeting scheduled in May. So we're still trying to figure out sort of the times for those meetings, so I won't go into all of that. But because we have an extension, as I mentioned in my opening remarks earlier, that the feds have allowed for us to submit the plan by May 24th. There is a state board meeting in May that we were hoping that we would get an approval by the state board, but that would then have to be preceded by an agreement by this joint advisory committee. I also understand the Board of Governors is meeting in May, but that's right about the same time that we would be submitting the plan. So we can certainly bring the transition plan to the Board of Governors, because I think we had also talked about a presentation on the guiding principles, so we can do that as well.
A follow-up question. So this was released on the 7th for a 30-day public comment period, and that would be the only public comment that we'll receive on this.
Well, the guidance document was released initially for states to provide guidance or to provide feedback, and I believe that California provided feedback by December 24th. So there was already an initial phase, correct?
Okay.
So this is a revised guidance document that you have before you.
Okay. And I'm asking these questions because I know that we haven't gone through a regulatory process. This is something that we're submitting, and I know that we want to keep in the spirit of ESSA, which is just address the question, don't go above and beyond. You all also, if you know, I was not a fan of ESSA, of the ESSA state plan that we submitted. And so I have a lot of feedback, and I had it on a thumb drive, assuming we would have computers. But I'm a little, in general, I'll say that I'm concerned that we didn't address some of the questions. So as we'll go through them, but even if we want to stay at a minimal level of addressing the question, I don't believe that we did that. And so for me, I'm a little concerned about the timeline for that reason. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? I saw some heads nodding.
I'll agree with the initial observation, and I'm just wondering, if we're trying to be broad and not specific, just give them what they want but not elaborate, at what level do we decide it's time to go to bullet points and be specific? Because there was that inconsistency as I'm reading through it. Just like on letter A, describe career technical education programs or programs of study, and it's very broad, but in section B, or C, forgive me, it becomes very specific. So I'm wondering, is there a theme to which we will be specific here, but very broad here? I was just looking for a little bit of maybe a rationale why we weren't as specific in describing the career technical education programs or programs of study.
Member Sun, it looked like you.
Yeah, we have a process to get through this so that staff has some feedback to bring back. Hearing some of the comments so far, and this is some of my feeling as well, is that we don't have a plan here. We have kind of a reaction to the questions, and the difference between that is that the reactions and responses is just kind of throwing everything in the kitchen sink, and that versus having a cohesive plan moving forward. And that's, I think, where it's been difficulty providing some feedback to this, because there is the inconsistency of where some of it's very broad and some of it's very narrow. And then there is also just, I think, a lack of cohesiveness. And so if I were to answer these prompts for this first one, I would say strengths is that, wow, California has a ton of initiatives related to CTE, and they're all in here. I would say the gap is then, what are we going to do with all of these in a cohesive vision moving forward? And so I feel like we're missing something like a discussion around, I don't know. I think we're missing, there seems to be a piece that we're missing as far as our conversation. Yeah.
Member Costa.
Yeah.
I want to go back to something that you said previously. Yeah. What we're missing is this is a laundry list of what we already have. Mm-hmm. We're not actually integrating what the Perkins dollars would right. mean to what we already have.
Right. Yeah.
And I think you made that point earlier, and I think, I agree that I think we're not answering some of the questions, and that we're kind of just providing an inventory versus providing the vision that is actually the underpinning of many of the things that we've done. Yeah. And how Perkins will really add to that, and how we should be programming those dollars in the same way that we think about all of these other programs we've already instituted at the state level.
Yeah. And I just wanted to bring up, I recently came across this California, a study done by Milbury, McLaughlin, and Barry Groves on the California Career Pathways Trust Grant Initiative. And it was a study on the funding, and it's a really interesting study because it comes up with some, it points out some of the challenges of that first set of grants that went out. And then it also talks about where the state might want to look at prioritizing moving forward in order to sustain these really quality programs. And we haven't really looked at some of these types of studies and have learned from it that would maybe help shape our vision moving forward. And I would just ask staff if they wouldn't mind sharing this with the committee, just so that we can read it and see that. And what I noticed among the study specifically was a call out for a state body, either an existing one or one that, a new one, that could serve as the agent to pull all of these initiatives together. And so I'm looking around at us saying, well, hey, what are we doing here, right? And so I would encourage us to take a look at this. Again, this was a study that was done on a very specific, the first initial CCPT. However, I think we could extrapolate maybe some of the lessons learned, and then also from other initiatives that have come along, and from what we've heard from the field, in prioritizing. So is it data? Is it professional development? Is it the providing more investment in cross-sector network capacities and partnerships? We've heard these themes come up, but we haven't really kind of pulled them together in a cohesive way.
Member Rucker.
I agree with the comments that have been stated, so I'm going to struggle not to repeat those, except to say I don't think we answered the questions in any part of this document. Let me begin by saying I think there needs to be a clear decision about what we're trying to accomplish with the plan. We have a WIOA plan. We have a workforce development plan. We have a framework. We have a number of legislative mandates. We have changed the relationship. We have consciously worked to change the relationship between the community colleges and the K-12 programs. We have a lot of stakeholders and entities that are involved in the delivery of CTE programs. And so when this question is about the programs and programs of study, there is no coherent effort in answering or responding to these questions to consider all of those elements. And so to be strategic, I think it's very important, first of all, that in answering the questions for this first section, we identify who all the agencies are that would be involved in doing this work. So we need to understand the roles that the K-12 programs have, the roles that any county offices will have, the differences in those roles and responsibilities for supporting and implementing those programs of study, and what are the differences in those programs of studies that can be offered by those different entities. That needs to be articulated throughout this first section. So that's part of being strategic, because what we then do is create accountability for all of our programs that are on this table today that would be articulated and identified in this transition plan. If the purpose of the transition plan is to move our existing programs into meeting the new mandates that are listed here, this transition program doesn't explain that. On pure content, I'm going to say again, we need to articulate the what as well as the who, and we need to have some internal consistency about what those relationships are. But most importantly, this is an opportunity for the state to do some systems thinking about this transition plan, so that this is just not another lovely thing to dust. There was a goal to try to create some coherence between the federal mandates and ESSA and our existing state mandates created through the Local Control and Accountability Plan and our state's accountability system. There is accountability that's built into Perkins that's clearly aligned to the system that we already have in place. If this is supposed to be an improvement plan for districts, an improvement plan for programs, it's not addressed in explaining what the programs of study are, but more importantly, how the programs of study are going to be used not only to improve student access, but to meet the charge in Perkins 5 that we improve the performance and the outcomes for students in those programs. So this plan does a great job of identifying what the programs are that we want to focus on, but it does so very narrowly. It doesn't consider the breadth of the work that's been done, nor does it explain what our thinking is about how we will hold those programs of study, whatever they are going to be articulated to be, accountable. I think I covered all the comments that I wanted to make, given the guidance that the good doctor gave us. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And just to say, I felt like we needed more time for this piece of the conversation, so I went with it. And I think there's clear consensus that there's kind of a foundational step back that staff might need to take with the plan. I still feel like we could walk through more of the responses and get some specific guidance, because I think even though there was big picture guidance, there was some really specific guidance right there from you, Member Rucker, on that answer. So if it feels comfortable to the committee, I think we'll somewhat continue with the plan, with the understanding that there's some real clarity needed about the vision we're trying to accomplish here. Member Costa.
There's just one theme on the community college side that I don't really think is incorporated, especially in the beginning point, which is that WIOA was a forcing function for the community colleges to really move into a regional model. And that regional model has been the basis of strong workforce for us. And it really requires that in programs of study that there is labor market data that says, yes, this is a program you should offer in this region because ultimately students can be employed in that industry. And that doesn't sound like it's groundbreaking, but at the time it really was. And I don't really see kind of in the entry that kind of evolution is really captured. And I think for us as a system, it's really important. And I hear from my colleagues from the state board that, in the principals document, that they're looking at similar themes. And so I think, we have kind of an inventory, and we do talk about strong workforce, but we don't really talk about that change and how we're administering the program. And I don't think that's an overpromise. I think that's the current state, and that especially in the beginning, we should really talk about that.
And I would just piggyback to that because that was one of my reflections, even in the opening statements around this intentional pivot towards reflecting the needs of regional economies. For someone who sat on the strategic planning process for WIOA, I could tell you both in terms of strong workforce and WIOA, that was clearly intended through our process. So how is that information feeding through regional, how is it reflective of regional economies, just given the difference among them?
Thanks, Member Salazar. Member Phan.
Yes, I echo some of the comments made previously regarding kind of mapping out, establishing the big picture, whether it's regional or statewide. But I probably will approach this from the standpoint of an instructor in CTE, specifically entrepreneurship, business, and the like. And I'm encouraged to see in the last paragraph of page 3, in that we'll require basically stakeholders of CTE to develop range of programs, and that there's a continuous studies that would take the students into the 4-year. And if I may be wrong, but I know that students who actually complete A through G and then get into the liberal arts, they basically have a clear map of courses that they take. But I'm not sure on the CTE side if that clarity of courses have been, that clarity has been developed, or the series of courses have been developed for students to continue for, say, let's say culinary arts at the high school, and then continue on to the community colleges, or specifically my college at Cosumnes River College with Cosumnes Oaks. I'm using a very specific instance here to paint the picture that we're just beginning to do that right now at our 2 institutions. And if we're beginning to do that right now here in Elk Grove, Sacramento, then that means that probably others may not have. And how can we actually, whatever program or whatever big picture we're trying to create, how can we encourage more of those programs, more of those 2 schools? I'm not even talking about districts, just 2 single campuses, to have more of those programs so that it's continuous, and for a culinary arts student at the high school level, identify at the high school level, to move through college and perhaps onto a 4-year. And I'm not seeing that very clearly yet at the CTE level. And again, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's been much discussion, but no clear picture and direction, if you will, as to how the community college can work effectively and efficiently with the high school for the students who aspire to be in one or multiple areas of CTEs. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my comment.
Thank you, Member Phan. Member Ortiz, Member Sun?
Oh, no,
Okay.
Go ahead. So I want to address specifically the students. If I was in California, I would have no idea who our student population in California is, because there was no reference to our student population. And in particular, we never defined our special populations. And I know that in the last meeting we had, we were using special populations with students with disabilities interchangeably. And we said we really need to understand who these special populations are. And per Perkins, they are students with disabilities, English learners, homeless, students of military families. And so we need to identify our population, because then we could answer, are we expanding access? Do we ensure equal access? Are we improving outcomes and reducing performance gaps? Without addressing the population and at least referencing a baseline or some data points, we won't be able to answer any of those other questions. And I understand, again, that we're aiming just to answer the question and not go above or beyond, but we're not doing that. And we also don't have any other than our guiding principles, any other document that reinforces that vision, right? For ESSA, we had the LCAP, so we could at least say, well, we don't have it in ESSA, but we have the LCAP template, and that captures some of the California way. But here, I feel like we're not including it here, and we wouldn't have it anywhere else. So I think that we need to start by identifying our special populations and not using words like including those from special populations, but instead, in particular, students of special populations, because that's really what this should be geared towards.
Thank you. Vice Chair Sun?
Yeah, so just, I mean, continuing on it, and I think this is kind of need to formulate a little bit clearer in my mind as I'm hearing the conversations. We're not defining the California way first, and we need to do that. And the California way is looking at regional model, it's local control, it's looking at the diverse population of California and how we're going to serve this diverse population of students. And so that vision needs to be the undergird this plan moving forward. And right now, even as I'm kind of re-looking at this first one, we still seem to be talking about K-12 and then community college. And they're different paragraphs. It really should be, this is California, this is how the different roles are feeding into that particular vision, and this is how each of these will be held accountable. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Point well taken. I'm going to move us on, or Chair Grande, did you have one last? Okay, great. I'm going to move us on. And again, spend a little extra time there, obviously, but I think we can make it up because I think some of the comments that were in reference to that question will be consistent throughout. So moving us on to still in programs of study, letter B, which has 3 subs. I,
Didn't answer that
1, 2, and 3.
I don't know how we're dealing with continuous improvement.
Do we need and want time to review?
We don't really say.
Or we're ready to just comment?
Yeah, we're ready to comment.
Okay.
The one thing I
Please.
noticed on this one, which is different from some of the others, is when there are subs to the major letter, they were addressing each of the subs separately. This one, it just puts it all together, but I don't think it answers the question at all. I don't think it describes the process, it doesn't include the criteria, and it doesn't address how we're assessing continuous improvement, expanding access, and inclusion of employability skills. So I really think that as they go back to redraft this, breaking it out so that they can whoever's drafting this can clearly see that they've created a response to how this is going to promote continuous improvement, separate from how this is going to expand access, separate from how it's going to support the inclusion, would be very, very beneficial just to make sure that each of the items has been included, because right now it doesn't appear as though we've done that.
Thanks. Member Rucker.
Okay, so I also want to say I don't believe the question was answered. I want to draw particular attention to the 3rd paragraph, beginning with an explanation about the programs of study that are going to be covered. This is a diversion from what was actually stated in the response to question A. So this is an example of the lack of internal coherence that's in the document. And so I think we have to be, while the goal may be just to answer the question, there needs to be a connection between what we said in one part of the application and what gets said in a subsequent part of the application. So what's written in this 3rd paragraph is very different from what the actual response was in A. Knowing that the response to A is going to be revised, this also needs to be revised.
Thank you. Other comments on this one? Member Salazar.
Maybe this is just a point of clarification. So everything also seems to be grounded around the CTMCS analysis. I guess I'm curious to know, has there already been a crosswalk against that, against the work that's happening in a strong workforce as it relates to the prioritization of industry-led efforts within the regions and what we're saying is happening? Does that make sense? Has that happened, and do we anticipate that might happen in relation to this plan so that there is congruency in terms of what's happening currently against where we plan to go?
Looking to Jeff and Donna on that.
Donna, does that make sense? Okay. So I guess my only concern being that if this is kind of a guidepost, wouldn't it be incongruent with what's currently happening in regions, and then how do we resolve for that incongruency?
So the CTE model curriculum standards were written to go across from middle school, high school, and then community college. So to say that CTE is aligned to those model curriculum standards, yes, beginning in middle school, extending to community college. I think when it comes to industry, the model curriculum standards, when they were originally rolled out, yes, industry had input. We did have, at the end of January, we convened a 2-day meeting in Los Angeles with 129 industry partners to get their early kind of thoughts on where we possibly needed to revise the model curriculum standards, because they are at this point 8 years old. So it's time to revise them so that we stay current with industry.
Yeah.
Does that answer?
It does. I was just
Okay.
curious to know how that was occurring, and if right now the push is around industry-led and reverse engineering from there,
Right.
but yet we're creating a plan that's focused on this. Do you see where there's a potential for collisions?
Yes, and again, this is just the transition plan. You know, it's difficult, it was difficult for me to start this without laying out the vision. It's kind of like starting at the middle of a book without the beginning. So I think much of what you're talking about is what's going to be laid out as you lay out the vision for career tech ed. And then certainly industry needs to be heavily involved in that.
More so to that point, and we struggle with this on the community college side in that it takes almost 2 years for our courses to be approved. But I don't know that a stagnant document is really going to serve the needs of our students going forward. That's a curriculum model. And I think it also speaks to the issue of continuous improvement. And I don't know. I mean, I think it's hard to kind of balance this idea of what's the right pedagogy and making sure that the students know what they need. But we also live in a world in which probably 2 new jobs have been created since we sat here that none of us thought about before we walked in. And so I'm just not sure how to make this nimble. And so, you know, and we are in transition, and so I think it's kind of hard to reflect that here. But I would just say it's something I think we really need to think about going forward, because we're not going to be successful if it takes us 2 years to develop, you know, the model curriculum for any given class.
I think the point that is based on this conversation is let's not use what it currently exists as the way for us to move forward, but to perhaps build upon, using these to build upon. But again, that goes back to the whole vision of where we want to go, and then utilize some of these as a basis from which to launch, but knowing that we have to continue to change.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to move us on. Okay, so this is letter C. Feeling us out if we want time to take a minute to collect thoughts, or ready to feel like people are
I think we're ready.
so prepared. Very high achieving committee.
Just a couple of typographicals first. On the 4th bullet point to the response, there are now 115 community colleges, so we probably want to include that. And then on the last bulleted response in that section for guided pathways, it describes guided pathways as a focus on counseling and student support to ensure students stay on track for course completion and graduation. But not all of our career education programs lead to graduation with an associate's degree, so we might not want to use the term graduation, but rather completion of programs or attainment of certificates. But I don't think any of the items that are listed here would actually fall into a language students, parents, and educators can understand. Educators would understand these resources and what it includes, but I do not believe that any of these resources would be in a language that students and parents can understand.
Thanks. Member Ortiz-Lacon?
Yeah, I was looking at this, and I go back to fully understanding that this is really just for us to receive funding, and it's sometimes perceived as compliance, but I think it's such a great opportunity for us to have a discussion, and specifically across 2 systems. And when I was looking at these resources, I thought, well, I've never seen any of these, but if I was a parent, which I am, how would I have access? I know that in K-12, if you hit the threshold of 15% of your student population speaking a particular language, we need to provide resources in that language. And here it asks resources in a language students, parents, and educators can understand. But we are not citing any languages other than English. So I think that we need to incorporate that and really ask ourselves, who is using these platforms? And are they high school students? Are they community college students? Do we see one group more than another by region? I think we should really use this opportunity to start taking inventory of how the resources are used, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that we are addressing our student populations and that we're meeting their needs. And if not for the purpose of this, at least this is giving us an avenue to have that conversation. So I would like to know who is using this. And we don't have to answer it for this particular plan, but it would be great to know, are we getting 2,000 hits or 500 hits? And are they from one system or the other? I'm not sure how they record who's actually having access to the platforms, but these are the things that I would like to know, and what other languages do we provide this information in?
Member Rucker.
The question asks about information that's provided by eligible entities and institutions, and the examples are given are primarily and specifically resources that are provided electronically by the state. I think there needs to be some type of statement or explanation about what it is the state expects the institutions that they turn around and fund. Since the purpose of this grant is the funds flow through the state down to these eligible institutions and entities, what is it the state is expecting them to provide, or information that they are expected to provide to the students and the parents and the communities that are participating in their programs? I think that information needs to be identified here, even if you don't specifically enumerate the school report cards or the school site web pages. What is it that the state expects these entities to provide as information and resources to parents, and more particularly then, as it gets to an understanding about the language that students and parents and educators can understand, it becomes more particularly important to know whether or not those local entities are being charged with that responsibility and how that oversight is being conducted.
Thank you. Vice Chair Sun.
Yes, so many of these questions, going back again to the framework of where we are, many of these questions align with our guiding principles. And I know that it was mentioned that we have these guiding principles, but if I were writing this and responding to this particular prompt, I would start with what we got in our guiding principle about strong presence of career exploration student supports is an essential component of establishing learning plans for K-14 students. Just establishes what we're about. And then, because this is going to different audiences, to list by audience what the different resources are available, which then would clarify who's got access to what and where it is, and what is the target audience for each of these career exploration, work-based learning opportunities, et cetera.
Thank you. Member Costa.
The question actually asked specifically about advisement, and we don't have any specific examples of advisement. And I'm assuming that if a student were to come into the community college system, our counselors would advise them about the career offerings, and I'm assuming that there's something similar on the K-12 side. Online web resources are great, but I think a lot of students really rely on a career or guidance counselor to help them make these decisions. And so we should include some content to that effect.
Thank you.
And then point of clarification to Patricia's note, then is the objective here to set some standards around the information that's being provided?
No, if that's what was gleaned from my comment, let me be emphatic. This is specifically asking what resources are provided by the eligible entities and institutions. The response that's given talks about what state, gives examples of state resources. So in responding to this question, there needs to at least be some statement about what the state has mandated or charged as a responsibility to the institutions that are going to receive this money from the state to provide as a resource. So they need to give an explanation about what the state has said. Oh, by the way, this district or this community college office, here's what you are responsible for providing as a resource about the information and the programs of study that you are funding through your institution. You need to put out this kind of information to your community, and here's how you need to do it. So, or here's what we're expecting. Here are examples of the things we're expecting to see.
Thank you for the clarification. Okay, moving on. Still in programs of study. Moving on to letter D. I'm not even going to ask if you need time to review because I have a feeling you don't. Member Rucker.
Okay, again, didn't answer the question. And this is looking at our principles, this goes straight to the issue or the guiding principle about system alignment and articulating what concerted efforts we are making among all of our stakeholder groups and all of our participating entities, what we're doing to align the system for not only delivery but program support. The perfect example is what Dr. Roberts explained about the work that's being done to implement the K-12 Strong Workforce Grant. Not only the looking at the metrics, but understanding the alignment, not only of the timeline and delivery of the system, but the types of internal work that's being done to educate all of the grant recipients and those who are participating. That's the type of work that facilitates collaboration among the eligible recipients, and that's what's not being explained here, and that's the type of stuff that should be addressed. So looking straight from our principles, taking from those principles, and then giving specific examples of work that's already ongoing and work that's in development going forward, I think that's what should have been developed here.
And I would also add, just also taking credit for what we've already done. I mean, we've used dollars to incentivize these behaviors, and I think it's important to help underscore in this section.
Chair Grande.
I'm concerned with the last paragraph in the response, as I think it may be taking the multiple measures out of context, because it gives the idea that AB 705 is meant to help shorten the pathway in career education, and AB 705 almost in its entirety deals with remedial placement for English, math, and ESL. And although the language of AB 705 does include for assessment, employment history, and vocational aptitude testing, I don't necessarily think that it would be appropriate for us to list it as facilitating collaboration in the development and coordination of education programs, because most of the time this multiple measures approach is being used not in such a way that people can streamline their career education, but streamline the general education that they may be taking concurrent with career education. So I think that we are almost in need of revising that entire paragraph so that it doesn't lead someone to believe that our AB 705 document is going to delete standardized testing. So, for example, using under a multiple measures approach, standardized testing is no longer used as a primary means of assessing if a student is prepared. I think it would be more appropriate to say standardized testing is no longer used exclusively as a primary means of assessing, and then the other criteria is high school and or college transcripts. But employment history and vocational aptitude testing would not be appropriate to the majority of the language of AB 705, which deals with remedial English, math, and ESL. And it's giving the idea that we would use those for placing them in courses in their progress towards degree and certificate attainment of career education. And that's not necessarily the intent of AB 705.
I don't think 705 is appropriate in this section at all. AB 705 is not about collaboration across segments. Honestly, it is a student-facing endeavor that basically says we know the research tells us that students that are placed in remediation drop out more frequently. And so what we're doing is instead of having high-stakes testing, much of what the state board dealt with in the accountability system, we're giving colleges the flexibility to look at different measures to try and predict whether or not a student can take coursework successfully. But it really doesn't mean that we're collaborating in any different way. It's just we as a system are looking at different measures. And, you know, although the guiding policy principles is a great document, just because we say we want people to collaborate doesn't make it so. So to me, in this section, this is really about, are there funding streams that we are associating with increased collaboration across segments? The regional approach under strong workforce certainly requires this, that people collaborate so that we're not duplicating career pathways in a particular region. This is a place where, there's just more concrete examples that can be provided.
Member Rucker.
I think it's also important, this was an opportunity to talk about the use of the CCI, the College of Career Indicator. That's not granular information about individual students, but it does provide information about what K-12 programs believe they are doing to prepare students to matriculate into the community college system. And that is a metric that continues to grow and mature over time. I think that conversation and that work should also be reflected here, because it is being informed by the conversations that are happening in this room and in multiple other stakeholder discussions.
Thank you. Okay, moving on, still in programs of study. Letter E, looking at data to determine alignment.
In this particular section, I think that we really need to answer the question and include in that response the regional consortia, the centers of excellence, and the sources of labor market information that we collect, because I don't really think it explains how we're using this labor market data to determine alignment. So maybe speaking about our emerging and priority sectors would be a great way to frame the response in this area, because I think then we can path into how we were using the labor market information to design the regionals. It's just my idea.
No, I agree.
And,
Vice Chair Sun.
yeah, and also throw in how data will also help with continuous improvement analysis of that.
Member Salazar.
Again, piggybacking on this is again where we've empowered the regions and the locals to help us inform this. So how is that being drawn into how the statewide effort is being described?
Thank you. Okay. Moving on to F, ensuring equal access. Member Ortiz-Lacon.
Yeah, I don't believe we state how we will ensure equal access. I think there's a vision that, or an assumption that all eligible entities do. We have no data to validate that. In fact, the data that we've seen would probably show that there are some racialized hierarchies in some of these pathways. So I really want us to be intentional about showing how we will ensure that. Maybe there are some ways that we prohibit placement prerequisites, but we know that still happens in practice. So if we maybe have some data that could show where are we in terms of who are the students that are part of these pathways, and delve a little bit more into that, and then answer the question, how would we ensure equal access? But also, how do we make all of our pathways robust? So yeah, I just don't think that we actually address that.
Member Rucker.
I think also as it relates to some of the specific types of supports that are being identified here, California has some of the highest ratios of students to counselors and students to other types of support programs. I think it's important to identify that data and to point that data out, not only at the K-12 level, but also at the community college level, because it is an ongoing goal to reduce and improve those ratios. That's not even discussed here as one of the ways that we're going to work to ensure that, because we have created those goals and we are specifically funding those goals in some particular ways, particularly through the LCAP. I think that needs to be addressed. I think also, just to simply say, yeah, we require it, you come to a four-way stop at 4 o'clock in the morning and nobody's there, you're required to stop. So to simply make statements that we're requiring people to do this, this is about, it says how ensuring means about accountability. What steps are we taking to hold these institutions that we are funding with this grant accountable? The question doesn't address how they're being accountable to do this.
Thank you. Okay. Moving on to letter G in programs of study, coordinating with state board. Chair Grande.
In this particular one, I think a response should describe the partnerships that are incentivized by the applications. So if we have a particular CTEIG or K-12 Strong Workforce application that says you are going to partner with a local school district, we should describe that in here so that we can show the coordination that's taking place. But also, it should specifically list how we are supporting the career pathway development and incentivizing in those priority and emerging sectors so that we're not seeing a whole bunch of duplication in areas where they're not needed.
Other comments on this one? Okay, move us along. Letter H. Another one about collaboration. Member Rucker.
Okay, again, I think we need to go back and start with, in answering in general any of these questions, we need to start with the guiding principles. But this one in particular, again, because it talks about collaboration, this is about not only just the collaboration, which is guiding principle C, but also the capacity building to implement a lot of these programs and to provide the support for these funded programs to do this work. So I think that we need to articulate not only what our guiding principles mean in implementing this, but then on the ground, how it's being operationalized.
Mm-hmm. Seeing a lot of heads nodding. Any other specific comments? Member Fan.
On that operationalize, I'm curious, how would you go about doing that, including in a response? Would you talk to individual school districts, or you would craft it from your own thinking, or how does that come about? I'm curious if you were to include it as part of a response.
Member Rucker.
Well, if I may, one of the things that has impressed me with the work the community colleges are doing right now is the way in rolling out the K-12 Strong Workforce Grant, how they operationalize the implementation of that grant through their regional networks and through the regional districts. I think understanding what the infrastructure is that we have and explaining that infrastructure and how it will either be used or improved to create alignment among all of our systems is a way of talking about operationalizing.
I think that's an excellent answer.
Well, I was going to say, I don't know why we don't have that example in this answer, because it is one of the rare instances where we actually are actively collaborating on this issue.
Yes.
And using dollars to do it.
Yes.
Incentivizing collaborative behaviors.
And also, just the reference back to the document I was talking about, talks about investing in the development of cross-sector network capacities at the regional level. And so we could talk about that, and that could be one of the emphasis and priorities with the funds.
So overall, I think if in our responses, if we can get specifics, we can get particulars, so that it's not only for the purpose of being approved, let's say, by the Federal Department of Education, but it serves as hints or possible strategies for the LEAs and the college districts to glean from, because I think the brain power rests with you all, right? The CD and the college chancellor's office.
Thank you, and I think you all are doing an amazing job of giving the big picture guidance with some specifics that I think staff can take back and incorporate into this next version. So thank you all so much for the very productive feedback. Moving on from letter H. Okay, letter I.
This part is just sad.
Yes.
I must say. Like, I feel like this is not evocative of the conversations that we as a state are having about special populations. And to my colleague's point, maybe it's because we don't define the special populations. I think if we did, we would have some more specifics here. But it definitely stuck out to me that, like, so much of education policy in California in the last 15 years has been around this issue, and it's the shortest response we have in the whole packet.
Oh, my God.
I was disappointed. I was also, I felt that to an extent, so many of the conversations we've had here have been focused and centered on equity, and none of that reflected here. So I thought, were we listened to? Because when we start, every single one of our principles really was anchored on this notion of equity and serving our students. And this was the shortest answer. It was the one that didn't address, it's something that is systemic in our state too. It's like, how do we improve outcomes and reduce performance gaps? And I don't know the data for CTE concentrators, but I would assume that it's very similar to our general K-12 population. I'm not sure how it looks in the community college. It's going to be our African American, Latino, English learner students with disabilities. And for us not to have a baseline, not to really put the effort into addressing this question, was very disappointing.
We have a brand new student funding formula on the community college side that is specifically addressed to equity, and it's not mentioned here at all. And that's both on our degree and our certificate side. And so, and I know that, you know, the administration is putting a little bit of a longer timeline on implementing it, but the philosophy is still there, and it's still law.
Thanks. Member Rucker?
Okay, so for the next couple of sentences, I'm going to say for the staff who know this stuff inside out, I'm rounding up. So according to the data that's been reported about the performance of our schools on the current academic indicators, we're 6 points below the standard in English language arts. We're 36 points below the standard in mathematics. And for all those schools that are on the state's lowest performing list of schools, the student subgroup that is common to most of those schools are students with disabilities. But I went a little bit further and looked at all of those schools that have now been identified for level 2 intervention from the state under the state's ESSA plan, and all of those high schools that are on that list receive Perkins funding. There should be some accountability for those entities that are receiving Perkins funding to pay attention in this plan for the additional support that's going to be provided to those high schools to address that performance gap. What shocked me is that wasn't even looked at or considered in writing this response, and it was just the easiest thing to find.
Thank you for that detail. Other comments on this one? Okay. Point well taken. J, dual or concurrent enrollment programs.
Again, this is just a current state of affairs statement. We're not in any way saying whether or not we're going to try and incentivize people to do this. This is just, we're kind of restating current law. And so to the degree this is a plan, and I don't know, I mean, I'm putting it out there, you know, do we want to incentivize eligible entities to do more of this?
Yes.
So we should just say that.
In the year-long reconnaissance that we did, this was one of the areas that we wanted to improve. And we've had conversations with people from the field that says, yes, we need a support in this area. And we talked about the cultures and the organizations not being able to talk to each other because it takes 2 years to approve a course, or it takes somebody to find somebody who has some kind of relationship. So this is definitely an area, and it doesn't specify in this response, doesn't reflect our conversation, but it also does not really provide us with ways that we can make this better.
And I don't know if staff want to comment again on the fact that this is a transition plan and there's an upcoming state plan too, and I think that was part of where we got stuck, or we're just hearing the feedback and ready to take it in and share next draft. Okay.
And I appreciate that this is a transition plan. So here's where I go with that. Usually, if it's not in the plan, it doesn't exist. So if we don't in some way identify or talk about what is being considered as we transition and what else will be in the broader, more granular plan that was fully developed, if we don't address it somehow or identify that as a priority or concern in the transition plan, I just know later down the road, if it's not in the plan, and when we ask, well, where is going to be a conversation about this, the response we will get back is, well, you didn't think about that or address that in the transition plan. So I may be disappointed that it's not in the transition plan today. I will be ticked if it's not in the fully developed, fleshed out plan, because somebody said we didn't need to be that granular in the transition plan.
Yes, Member Fan.
This particular issue I've been working on for the past probably 2 to 3 years as co-chair of a dual enrollment task force, if you will. And I have no qualms with the language included here. I thought it's like she said, status quo, and we should be including it in here as a response. But my question, I think, is probably to whether it's board members or local districts or even statewide district. How can we actually get school principals, school counselors, school teachers to actually engage in this dual enrollment? Because
we could
not
give them
happening.
Perkins funding.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, honestly, if our state plan basically said we're going to incentivize these types of programs,
That's where I'm getting
I
at.
would
Yes.
bet they would talk to each other.
Because the legislation may be there, the intent on some of the folks may be there, but it's not incentivized somehow. And so there's no movement for the past 4 or 5 years that we've been working on with a particular school district. No movement. And I actually was getting frustrated. So however we craft it in the response, the language may be adequate, but we've gotten to put some carrots or sticks or whatever it is out there for this to occur. Because in a forum with parents, when I laid this out, they said, oh, wow, I really want my kids in there. But they're not available.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Sun?
So, yeah, and I think to both Member Costa and Member Fahn's point regarding the specific dual enrollment issues, didn't we bring up at the last meeting that perhaps what if we were to take some of the Perkins State funds and convene a committee, an intersegmental committee that could talk about streamlining the processes for dual enrollment, concurrent or concurrent enrollment programs, and talk about how we can streamline the processes for organizations that would benefit statewide and not just rely on individual campuses working with individual high schools and LEAs. So, I mean, that could be something, it's a plan to think about how we could utilize funds to be able to make that happen and move the needle.
I also think in the regions, the WIOA consortiums, like this is the perfect conversation to be having. You know, a region could decide at that table to basically have a program that bridges between the segments. They could use state funding, Perkins funding. I mean, they have a variety of funding sources that could be utilized. And we do now have the infrastructure more so than we did even 5 years ago to facilitate that. But I think, you know, and staff can correct me if I'm wrong, I think the bulk of the funding for this is on the Perkins side, not the state side. So that's why I think, you know, we could use funding to incentivize this behavior at that level.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on. I thought I heard a little utterance. Okay, last one under programs of study, letter K.
Very last one.
Member Rucker.
Well, I don't know if it's true for the community college board meetings, but at almost every board meeting where we were having discussions about the local control and accountability plan, there were busloads of parents and other stakeholders who came to the board meeting to urge the board to in some way figure out how to make sure the county offices and the LEAs were accountable for how, not only whether or not they met with parents, but how the input and the concerns and priorities of parents and other stakeholders were actually shown and reflected in the plans that were developed. So again, this response doesn't answer the question, but I think this is an opportunity to talk about not only what stakeholder engagement is supposed to look like, but to take into account our failures on creating or establishing norms at the local level for effective effective stakeholder engagement and ways that we hold these entities accountable for not only reporting which meetings they had, but from those meetings, what is reflected in the plans that based on the feedback from those meetings. I think that that is something that should be developed in this transition plan. It's not as a way of creating accountability, but to ensure that there are real norms for collecting feedback and for assuring that they know how that feedback should be reflected in those plans that are actually submitted and implemented.
I would just say it's a little different for us on the parent side, and I'm looking at my faculty members. It's a little strange, though, that our consultative process isn't in here. We have a very rich process in the community colleges of really anything that has to do with curriculum, having a consultative process either at the campus or the statewide level with our faculty and with the administrators of a college. So, and basically everything we do in community colleges goes through that process.
Exactly, that was the point I was going to make. We do not have parents at most of these meetings because many of our students are already parents. So, but whether it's at the state level consultation process or at the district or campus level, in fact, many individual campuses or districts now have established consultation group, if you will, to ensure that all stakeholder voices of the various stakeholders across the district or this campuses are heard. So I think if you can actually insert some of that, maybe Jeff can assist with that, to highlight what organizations or groups that are established currently or that will to highlight the integration of the different voices and stakeholders' interests.
Chair Grande.
I would just like to see in this response some form of an interest or a sentence about how we're going to get them involved from the beginning, not just in evaluating the programs, but also selecting the programs that are going to be included in the Perkins 5 application. So if we really are going to involve parents, academic, career, and technical education teachers, administrators, it should begin with what we're doing right now. The fact that we are holding this open session, public forum, we should be describing that in here because we are going through the consultative process right now. And although there are several items bulleted as what will happen in the future, many of these are happening right now, and I think we should describe them.
Vice Chair Sun.
Okay, and then just on the K-12 side too, that while I completely agree we need to refine our feedback system engagement at the local level, we could mention the LCAP. Wouldn't we want our LEAs to incorporate how they're going to develop programs, CTE programs using Perkins funds along with their larger plan, LEA plan? So incorporating the LCAP plan and how that engages stakeholders would be helpful as well. Just again, kind of talks about the more statewide approach to engaging stakeholders.
And while we're on that about plans, let's not forget we have at the school site council level the school plan for student achievement, because particularly for high schools, students sit on those site councils, and so that's an important opportunity to focus on ways that we bring in the student voice in this conversation. Focusing on the school plan for student achievement for these high schools that receive the funding is another way of bringing that point in as well.
Member Salazar.
And it's not specific to the response on this question, but more so in terms of just process moving forward, recognizing that currently we're responding to a transition plan, but obviously this should be the foundation for the state strategic plan. And I would encourage staff to engage with the State Workforce Development Board staff who did the WIOA strategic plan, in part because there was a process established by which we were engaging multiple agencies, a clearly defined crosswalk in terms of what were some high-level opportunities, and really what the WIOA strategic plan was a framework that was intended to guide the locals in terms of implementation. As we look forward to our comprehensive plan, I would encourage us to try to use that as a blueprint for how we move this process forward.
Thank you. So we're about halfway through our time and a little more than halfway through our responses, so doing great on time. It feels like it might be a nice time for a break before we move on to meeting the needs of special populations.
Yes, I think that is a great idea, Heather.
Chair Grande, I'll turn it over to you to time us out.
So this is a great time to take a small break. It is 2:55, and if we can take maybe 15 minutes, come back at 3:10? All right. We are in recess. All right, folks, it is 3:11, and I would like to reconvene our meeting. I'll turn this back over to Heather, and we'll continue our discussion of the transition plan.
Thanks, Chair Grande. Hopefully we got a little brain break. Yes, Member Costa.
Can I just ask a process question? Because I think a couple of us on the dais were just kind of wondering if you could talk about how the document was developed. I think it would help us as we're asking questions to know kind of the process between CDE and the Community College Chancellor's Office and what we're seeing before us.
I'm going to look at staff to chime in on that. Thanks, Donna. The beauty of being the facilitator, I just get to draw feedback and ask staff for input.
So the document was written primarily by me and through also key contributions from Patricia DeCoste as to edits, things that I had missed, things like that. Community College, I think probably Jeff or Matt should respond to that, but it was primarily Patricia and me doing the primary writing, and then Patricia providing edits and inclusions and perhaps things that I hadn't thought about. So, and I think I'll turn it over to Jeff.
Well, can we thank you, Donna, for the amount of labor that you put into this to have a document in front of us today that we would be able to read? Thank you.
Hi, Jeff. Thanks.
Good afternoon. Thank you. So the Community College Chancellor's Office received 2 revision opportunities. So we received the document twice, looked at it twice with the staff level, and then we began to make plans for how we would include more voices into the review process. Currently, we had plans to have at our upcoming California Community College Chancellor's Office, or at CCAOE, I don't know the whole, it's an acronym, I've got to dissect it. It's California Community Colleges Administrative Educators or Occupational Education Administrative Conference. Jeez. We just call it CCAOE.
Shall I try for
Try
California
it again.
Community College Association for Occupational Education.
Yes, there it is. I'm glad you know. I just refer to CCAOE because we do acronyms here. So we were having a plan to have the Perkins 5 plan and transition plan presented to our constituents there and to also receive feedback at that point. I'm hearing a little bit tighter timeline today, so we're going to revise that, potentially try to see how we can get the feedback a little earlier so there's more process time for review. We were looking at the end of May is what we were hearing as the time for the final for the transition plan. So that's kind of where we are. We've had 2 review processes with staff internally.
Member Ortiz-Lacon.
So can you tell me a little bit about the stakeholder engagement? I know that for ESSA that was a requirement. So I'm wondering, you're going to take this to that group. But on the K-12 side, who was previewed to this beyond CDE and State Board?
At this point with the transition plan, the feds did not require any stakeholder feedback. The plan going forward was to go ahead and post this for at least a 30-day review, but as of right now, the transition plan does not require a stakeholder feedback. The full plan, yes, obviously, and the stakeholders are actually identified in the Perkins legislation.
Was the approach to, is that because this isn't a transition plan that would just respond minimally to prompts based on what currently exists?
Yes, that was basically my understanding is respond to the prompts as minimally as possible. And I did have a conversation with our federal liaisons around the transition plan because they said I would be reticent to put anything in there that commits us. And they said, no, this is the transition plan. What they're really focused on is the fiscal responsibility piece of it. They want to make sure that the funding is going to programs of study. So that's the initial feedback, because again, what you're looking at, what we wrote to, or what I wrote to, was the first guide. Now there's a second guide. There's going to be a third and final guide. So this is still an iterative process going forward. We don't ultimately know what the final guidance is going to be. So, in fact, there are sections that we wrote to that are not required of the transition plan, but they're there. There's going to be edits, there'll be revisions, but I couldn't see taking it out at this late point. So.
Well, I appreciate that information, and I must say that thank you for the parting gift. But if we're looking at future iterations of this, if I may suggest, rather than the CCCO staff being in a review body or in a review mode, that we actually take a more collaborative mode, in that perhaps jointly sharing notes or co-writing is my thought.
Would agree. And I think what you're hearing too from this committee is that even though this is a transition plan, and understanding the approach to this, that we still would like to see a setting of a vision as we're moving forward, because that is going to provide the momentum for the larger plan as well.
Thank you so much, both of you.
And thanks, committee members, for the clarifying questions. I think that's really helpful. Okay, so moving on to the section on meeting the needs of special populations. I think Member Ortiz-Lacon already commented that we want to make sure to elaborate what those special populations are, and rather than including some language that talks about emphasis on, but I want to open it up to the floor for letter A to start.
Is it possible to get more specific information about how large this special population might be? Because it could have a tremendous impact on what programs of study may be included in this particular transition plan. But if we can identify the special populations, describe the special population, and then enumerate the numbers, I think it would be very helpful.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think that does echo an earlier comment also. Other thoughts on this one? Yes.
I think, and I'm trying to remember which section, I'm looking at Russ in the audience, and he could probably tell me exactly where it is, but I remember in the WIOA plan, there was some specific discussion about inclusion and about the diversity of the populations that were particularly going to be served in the infrastructure of the implementation of those programs. So I think, again, this is an opportunity to unify all of the different types of plans and funding streams and activities that we have that are related to this. So I think that, we need, especially since it keeps being hammered into me that this is a transition plan, we have articulated some specific concerted activities related to this that should be reflected in this document.
Thanks. Member Ortiz-Lacon?
Yeah, I want to make sure that, I was thinking of a professor who told me as an undergrad, Felisa, do not describe the rose, make it blossom in your paper. So I'm like, let's not describe the rose, let's make it blossom, because I think that there's a little over-reliance on hyperlinking. Yeah. And I certainly review grants, I submit grants. I started actually clicking on some of the hyperlinks, and there's really good information, but had I not taken that second step, which a lot of reviewers won't, I wouldn't have access to some of those materials. So I think it's important for us to describe it a little bit more. The guiding policy principles are cited here. You would have to then take that second step to click and see what we mean by that. But really making sure that we're describing the vision. And for me, even though this is a transition document, it is a foundation. It's foundational. I know that we've had some changes in this body, and so I certainly want to continue. But if I wasn't part of this body at a later point, I want to make sure that there was something left behind that really signified, like, this was the thinking at that time, and we want to honor the thinking that we've had thus far. And again, just calling out the special populations, and it's also by systems, right? Because I don't know that in the community college, the need is the same as it is in K-12, the same populations. I have a sense that it is, but I also know that in other community college systems that I've been part of, in terms of collaborating out of state, African American males have been the #1 under-enrolled, underserved population. Is that the case in California? I don't know, right? So just adding some data points, and I know that we may hesitate, but a baseline, we could be maybe not delve into the data that much, but let's just add a baseline.
Member Costa.
To bloom the rose, I would say we should really cite our vision for success. We have a lot of rich information in our board-approved Vision for Success document about closing achievement gaps and a commitment to all students. And so I certainly think that should be referenced here, and there's probably a lot of good material that we could pull directly from the vision document.
Thank you.
In addition to the vision document, we also have the 25 recommendations of the Strong Workforce Task Force that we could use in conjunction with the responses here.
Great. Thanks for the specific pointing us to references. All right, we'll move on. So still meeting the needs of special populations, letter A, but now sub-bullet 2. Member Rucker.
Well, in the K-12 system, or with K-12 programs, we have an issue already with significant disproportionality as it relates to data we report in our state about students and identifying and referring students to special education programs. It would be a particular concern to find out if that particular issue creates an obstacle or even a bar for students to be able to even participate if they're being over-identified for receiving certain types of special education services, and how this may interfere with or not be considered in the work that's being done here. So this response doesn't answer the question. I think there is a bifurcation that has to be explored in answering this question, the differences between what's happening in K-12 programs and what's happening at the community college, because I don't think community colleges have that particular issue, but it is an issue in K-12 programs.
Okay, moving on. Still in letter A, sub-bullet 3. Any specific feedback on this one? Member Rucker.
Well, as it relates to, again, we have a lot of guidances in our curriculum documents and frameworks about meeting program needs and scaffolding curriculum to implement program needs for students in these special populations. So I think designated supports and all of those infrastructures that we have put in place should be identified and specified as a part of the response here. That's not overpromising. That's something we've already mandated in our framework documents and in our LCAPs and in the student plan, for the school plan for student achievement. So I think those things should be articulated here.
Any other comments on this one? Okay. Okay.
Heather, before you move on.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. I mean, I think just, again, an overarching theme and one that I saw reflected both in our state WIOA plan as well as some of our strong workforce efforts. It's really around this notion around family sustaining wages. And so it does go slightly beyond high skilled, high wage. It's also around how are we ensuring that we're making that a priority.
Thank you. Okay, still meeting needs of special populations, question A, and then and 5.
Can I ask that 4 and 5 be separated out for the response, just for continuity throughout the document?
Thanks, Chair Grande. Member Rucker?
And again, we have a really good RIOA plan, and it really does address elements that are being requested for a description as it relates to item 5, and I would just recommend reviewing some of that and considering including that.
Member Ortiz-Lacon?
Yeah, I would like to add language support and accommodations. As part of the special populations, we have English learners and I believe newcomers, and so we want to make sure that we reflect them.
Thank you. Any other comments on this one? Okay. Moving on to fiscal responsibility. And just as a reminder, Donna mentioned that this is an area where particular attention is going to be paid in the review. Yeah.
So I
Member
know that
Costa.
we're using their prompts, but none of this reads to me of fiscal responsibility, says the person formerly with finance. Fiscal responsibility is, basically turning the spigot off of future funding if you don't meet, requirements, or in the case of discrimination, which was in the previous things, that you would be precluded from receiving future funding. But in these things, it's like, this is not fiscal responsibility. This sounds like accountability to me. And so I know these are just their prompts, but it seems like a strange way to describe the answers that we've provided.
Member Rucker?
Well, I remember from the overview that was provided to us back in the fall that one of the major policy shifts for Perkins 5 was this enhanced or even heightened attention on accountability, and they define accountability as program outcomes, not expenditures, but program outcomes. And so these questions under fiscal responsibility make sense given the fact that the lawyer who talked to us about this, and it's really interesting to hear lawyers talk about education policy, but he did a good job. The lawyer who spoke about this said that programs are going to be responsible for improving student outcomes. So if the goal of the fiscal responsibility prompt is to link paying attention to underachieving students and saying, because I spent this amount of money on that program, did student achievement improve? That was the purpose, that was the goal of Perkins 5. So these questions make sense, given that's the goal of Perkins 5, that districts and any entity receiving the funding has to show that because they spent this money, student achievement actually improved. So the questions make sense if we understand that that's what they're actually after. They're not interested in maintenance of effort or supplement, not supplant. They're not interested in that kind of accountability. They're saying if you spend $100 more on this program this year, did your scores go up, and can you show us you understand why your scores went up as a result? So that makes sense. If we understand that, I don't think that in writing this response, it was understood that was the purpose of the fiscal response. So this entire section, I have to tell you, needs to be rewritten, because it's not about paying attention to justifying how you make dollar expenditure decisions based on what your data says about the performance of your students. There's no clear understanding about how programs have to evaluate the performance of their programs or the performance of their students in making decisions on how to spend the money to target those students. It's really about that targeted program assistance, and they are saying, as a result of spending this money, this is what we believe the outcome should be. That's not what's being addressed in this section.
Member Ortiz-Lacon.
So with that, I was thinking about what you mentioned earlier, Board Member Rucker, that out of the high schools identified in the bottom 7%, which is what we turn out having, every single one of them received Perkins, right? And so I thought, well, okay, that isn't at face value. It's like, but could they have been? We don't know that they didn't improve, right? And so being identified in the bottom 7% doesn't tell us that they didn't improve over the course of time because of this additional funding, because we're not getting that sort of longitudinal data. So it would be great for us to know where are the schools now, and what is the difference that this pot of funding would do in terms of student outcomes? And I was just thinking about that because, when you said it,
Yeah,
I was
well,
like,
I can answer that for right now, comparing the performance just for those high schools.
yeah, the high school.
I can't say for the community college programs, but just for the high schools that were identified for this level 2 intervention, I did go back and look at what the dashboard said about their performance in 2017 and 2018. Overall, there was a decline among most of those high schools on the academic indicators. This is why it's important to know that this is about the transition plan. This question is saying, okay, so now we're in a new era for funding these programs with Perkins. Now that you know your schools are not creating the academic outcomes you want to create, when we give you the funding for 2019-20, what's going to be different in the programs, and how do you know that spending the money in this way is going to improve the outcomes for your students when the performance for the school is reported in the 2019 dashboard? That's what should be identified here. And again, you probably need to bifurcate the answer to talk about what the data is saying for the programs that are already funded, and what it is we're asking them to pay attention and do differently going forward. That is the real transition, and I don't think a lot of schools understand you're going to be accountable for this money in a different way.
Yeah, which then brings the thought that we do have in the ESSA state plan these interim targets for academic indicators.
And we know those,
that
and they're not articulated
to
here.
know exist.
Yes.
And if we're trying to integrate our plans, that would be one starting point for our K-12 schools, is looking at what are the targets that we set in the ESSA state plan. And I know that we're nowhere near that, right? Because we didn't have a 13-point gain for African-American students in ELA, or 17-point gain in math. But at least it's a starting point to say we are looking at both plans, and we're making an effort to integrate and look to see what is the North Star when it comes to academic indicators.
Yeah, so academic achievement is separate from these other indicators, and academic achievement is defined differently for the community colleges than it is defined for the K-12s. We have specific targets articulated in the state plan that districts must meet for academic achievement. Those must be addressed in this plan.
Any other comments on this one?
Just again, the community college funding formula, I think, is something that we should have in this particular section, because we definitely talk about number of certificates that are awarded, and so we actually do have the mechanisms to track that.
And Amy, just to be clear, you're referring both to the student-centered funding formula and the strong workforce performance?
Yes,
Just
it's
wanted
in
to clarify.
both.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Okay, moving on to question E, under fiscal responsibility. Member Rucker.
Okay, so even though there's current flexibility now in Perkins 5 to fund elementary programs, and even though in all of the previous sections in the response to the previous questions, it says K-12, the response to this question specifically says we're funding secondary and post-secondary programs. This is what I meant when I said earlier that there's some internal inconsistency in the document. If there's no intention to fund elementary programs, then in the rest of the document where we talk about K-12, we need to specifically say we're only focusing on and responding to these questions as it relates to the grade levels that we will be funding in this grant. So I missed a meeting when the decision was made that we're only going to fund secondary and post-secondary programs. So if that's the case, then everything in the previous section needs to focus only on those grades that will actually be funded. But if there is some intentionality to look at elementary programs as well, then this question needs to be reframed.
I'm going to go in the Wayback Time machine and say, when I read this question, and I'm looking at Patricia, who will probably remember, when we talk about unified and union high school districts, it makes me think that the underlying calculation here was old revenue limits.
Yeah.
And we need to talk about LCFF. The world has completely changed, and it's not like, hey, we're going to think about it when we get the new state plan. Like, we're changing it. We have to, because the whole underpinning of K-12 finance is different.
Chair Grande.
I just wanted to question whether or not the specificity of the dollar amounts in B would be more appropriate for moving to C, where the prompt says provide the specific dollar allocations. So some of this, some of this information may just move over to C, and we might end up drafting a new response, especially separating out the Roman numeral I from the Roman numeral II.
I was waiting for you to say that. Okay. Other comments on this one? Moving on to C now, where maybe the specific dollar amounts might be placed. Other comments on C?
I agree with you on that.
Okay, agreement from Member Rucker on that. And everybody is nodding, so yes. Other comments on this one? Okay, then move us along to letter D.
On this one, the first bullet point, the Board of Governors grant, it now has a different name, so we may want to update.
Thank you. Anything else on this one? Okay. Oh, Member Salazar.
How do we account for undocumented students? And is that
Say that
how do we account for undocumented students?
Okay.
Okay. I mean,
85-40,
so
right?
do we include
I mean,
like
but you might not
California
wanna
Dream
include
Act in here as a specific? Do we include California Dream Act here? Okay.
Okay. So a note to staff to think more
Yeah.
specifically about that. Thanks. Okay, letter E under fiscal responsibility. Any specific comment? Member Rucker?
Yeah, we actually need the data.
Yeah.
Identify the data and the data sources and the specific data that will inform the decisions that are made to evaluate this conversation.
Thank you. Other comments on this one? Okay, F. Might be another one to pull out the specific responses. Yes, Member
Well,
Rucker.
and this one I had a question on, because I did try to go and read the guidance and go back and look at the waiver policy. I'm not really clear on how, I know it says the state does not intend to request a waiver on any of that, but since we know the guidance is being updated, how do we know we may not need a waiver on some of this? Because I was confused on some of the information that was provided, and I don't know if even our waiver policy needs to be updated to address some of the sections that are specified, like in section 131B. There are some things in our current waiver policy that we probably need to update anyway, and if we don't update it, we would need to make a request a waiver because we would already be out of compliance, I think.
Okay, I see Donna coming up to the table on this one.
I actually had a specific conversation with our federal liaison around that because I said, I'm not sure that we wouldn't want to apply for a waiver. So the recommendation that I got from him was to use that statement, that at this time, we don't foresee a waiver. But again, this is the transition plan. It's not the final, because again, you're right, we're still waiting for the final guidance. So something could change.
Okay, okay. So that, all that hedging, that's, okay.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
Thanks, Donna. Any other thoughts on F? Moving on to G.
We just don't really answer number 2. I know that we currently have a waiver, but we don't, in this response, specify why we have the current waiver and how the alternative allocation is better. So I would just ask that we include that content.
Other comments on G? Member Rucker?
Yeah, doesn't the answer to G seem different from, antithetical to what was written in F? So we said under F, so the question is, if you'll submit an application for a waiver to the secondary allocation formula, the first sentence in responding to G says we already have an alternative formula and that we're going to request a renewal of that alternative
I
formula,
think the difference
which was
is
a
between
waiver.
secondary and post-secondary allocation, which are different formulas.
Okay.
So we have one in post-secondary. I don't know why secondary doesn't have one.
That's my question. That's my point. Yeah.
Especially in light of the fact that all funding in recent years in the K-12 side of the house and higher ed has placed an emphasis on the old economic impact aid or a weighted formula for disadvantaged students. So I can't speak to the K-12 side, but I'll just say, the history of funding formulas in the state on both sides has definitely been more of an emphasis on putting resources in disadvantaged communities. Honestly,
Yeah.
there's concentration grants around not just disadvantaged students, but districts and school districts that have.
Yeah, that's
more
my
of that
point. It's an
population.
opportunity for us to look at a weighted student formula as a way of implementing the allocation of these grants at the K-12. So that's my exact point, yeah.
So are we suggesting we should, in the prior prompt?
Well, we can leave
not.
that sentence, we're not considering a waiver at this time, but I think it's
We
incumbent
should.
on doing this work
Okay.
to write this grant or to write this plan, that we think about a weighted student formula and look at doing some alternative formula for that.
Okay, and then do we need to clarify this is for post-secondary, or it was for?
Oh,
the
it does,
community?
it says it.
Okay.
It
yeah,
says
all right.
it.
Any other thoughts on this one? All right, coming into the last response here. H.
I have a question on whether or not we actually intend to have $1 trillion or if it's supposed to be 1.585 billion.
Billion.
Because I would love for it to be $1 trillion. I really would. I believe career education deserves it.
Okay, but this also says the fiscal effort per student or aggregate expenditures for the state. So this is reporting all the aggregate information, but beginning next year, both the LEA report cards and the site level report cards will provide fiscal information on per pupil expenditure. So I don't see why that can't be included here as well, because it will be getting reported beginning next year. We've already got the data element added to the report card, and districts are already uploading that information for reporting beginning next year, so I don't see why that can't be included.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I
Member
think there's
Costa.
maybe some data points missing on the community college side as far as expenditures. I noticed that CDE, I don't know, it has 1.2 million general state funds to CDE. I don't know if that's your administrative costs, but I would imagine that there's a corollary on the community college side. If we are including that, I don't really know if that's appropriate based on the question, but it should just be consistent, I think, across the systems.
Here's Matt to address that.
I think that list was one that we got from Department of Finance in terms of a summary of all funds that are in play in the state for CTE. So that's where that list was coming from.
But it also asks about associate degrees.
Yeah.
And, obviously this doesn't account for any of our work on ADTs, which would really increase this dollar amount. So, yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Other comments on this one? All right, well, I just want to reiterate my thanks to you all for both the high-level comments and the specific comments. I think the nice thing for staff is there was a lot of consensus from the committee, so they have a lot to work with. I heard a lot about regardless of whether this is a transition plan or the state plan, to lay out some vision, to connect to the guiding principles, to really specifically answer the questions, to use data, to better utilize what we're already doing and build on that, to really put some emphasis on special populations, to talk about return on investment in the fiscal responsibility side, and to really call out collaboration. And I think a call also for greater collaboration among staff here in writing the plan on both sides of the house. Yeah, and figuring out that balance all within the timeline that we have. I'm going to call up Tom Adams to talk about that tricky solution. As you know, we have another meeting coming up March 11th, so it's a really quick turnaround time for staff to get something back out to you all.
So one thing to keep in mind is we do have a posting requirement on March 1st. So if you think about between now and that posting time, one thing I checked in with staff is I think some of the aspects on coming from community college will be pretty easily incorporated. But I think also one of the key things is to go back to that first question and actually do a more extensive rewrite. And so rather than try and rewrite everything, maybe it might be better to come back to you with, say, that first question and a couple other responses so we get some of your, we have a better understanding of what you would like to see in there, rather than try and rewrite and respond to all questions, before the first. So if you're fine with that, I'm thinking the first question, maybe going back to some of those questions on that are centered on issues of access and equity. So we'll work with the chairs and kind of targeting some questions based upon, say, the extent of the comments, and come back to you with the select revisions on different questions in different parts, so that then you'll get a better sense of things rather than us doing an entire rewrite. Yeah.
I think that's a good idea. Let me suggest that you come back with a revised response to the first question in the section on the education programs and programs of study, but also consider doing the rewrite on the first question concerning meeting the needs of special populations, and then also the fiscal responsibility question, because again, the response missed the point about tying dollars to how you understand why the dollars need to be spent that way. So explaining our philosophy about fiscal responsibility as we've put it together under the California Way and the LCAP, the Local Control Accountability Plan, I think if we start at least on that with the K-12 side and with everything that's gone on with the College Promise and AB 705, if you can come back with revised responses to the first questions in each of those three sections, that might be helpful.
Right, and then we can spend the next meeting figuring out, okay, does this answer your questions? The other thing is, on some of these more technical issues, staff will work on the background in terms of talking to Brustein and Manasevich, as well as keeping you up to date on any federal guidance or that comes to us.
And Tom, just for clarification then, so I think this, in terms of process moving forward, suffices for the transition plan. Simultaneously, will the department be thinking about what is the processes and steps that will be taken for the state strategic plan? Are those going to happen in parallel to one another, or do you anticipate them being sequenced? Just so that the kind of the synergy and the energy that's kind of reflected in today's comments is captured.
So I think as we move along in this and we get a better understanding of what would be in the transition plan, we also know that it's kind of initial steps towards the actual major plan. And I think I take to heart Patricia Rucker's comment that what's in the plan, it's a lot easier to modify what's in there rather than trying to put something new in later. And I think what I'm hearing is you'd like to forecast some of the things you want to see in the actual plan, in the transition plan as possible.
Yes.
Right. And so in that sense, we will maybe maybe there'll be extensive discussion that's very rich, and maybe not all of it is appropriate for the transition plan, but we need to capture that and make sure it's part of the actual plan. So that's what I'm taking that as.
I mean, it could be a sentence as, in furtherance of this conversation, the state is also looking at, and
Yeah.
just, do it that way.
One of the major issues is, and we expect to, right?
Yes, something,
Right.
any of those kind of,
Right.
Can I ask a question about public comment? Because by the time we meet, March 11th, will we have public comment with the window closed? It was a 30-day window. Will you have time to turn around the comments? And the last time we discussed this, we said maybe doing it like the frameworks where we accept or reject public comment and why. Will we have that to look at?
Well, when our agendas go public, we do get public comment just from people responding to us, and we give that to you. Keep in mind, one of the things we will have to do is later when this transition plan comes before the board, that will have a 10-day window. People who are in the know of this issue will come and it won't be a surprise. We are trying to keep, our stakeholders up to date on this as we go through, but to actually have a formal 30-day public comment period like we do on a curriculum framework, we won't be.
Oh, I thought we had this out. I thought that went out on the 7th.
So we have had versions out there, but we haven't done a structured, formal public comment period.
Oh, okay.
Right. But we take people's input all the time. But in the sense like we did on a curriculum framework, or here's the nearly completed document accompanied with a formal survey form, things like that, no.
When you were referring earlier to the final guidance document, that's what's coming from the federal government, and that's the 30-day window that's going to close.
Right.
So there's still going to be another final guidance document that will frame some of the responses.
Right.
Got it, okay.
Yeah, I was thinking you were referring to our transition plan, sorry.
Okay, now I confused both. I thought our transition plan was out for public comment. I'm like, it's the first time I see it. How is it out already for public comment? Okay.
Are there any other comments for either Heather or Tom? Then let me thank you once again, Heather, for facilitating this incredible conversation. I think I can speak for the rest of the members up here in thanking all of the staff for the hard work that went into this initial transition plan. The conversation has been robust. I believe we've given some direction. I know that you've asked for the feedback guide to be submitted today, so I'll remind everyone the comments that you may have made on either the feedback guide or on the actual transition plan. They can use those to help frame the second draft that we'll see.
Please.
And I can't wait to see what this is going to develop into. So. All right, with that, I believe we can thank everyone for this discussion and thank members of the public for attending and see if there are public comments that you have on any of the transition plan conversations that we've just entertained. I'll remind anyone, if you're providing comments during public commentary, that we limit speakers to 2 minutes apiece, and we ask that you state your first and last name for the record before speaking. So are there any comments from the public? No? No? Well, then, is there any additional comments from members of the Joint Advisory Committee?
Can I ask?
Yes, please.
Our meeting on the 11th, what time? Have we decided?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, we were waiting to hear back from Member Fawn. If I believe I don't mean to isolate you but we were wondering, when are you available on March 11th?
The 11th is a Tuesday?
No, I believe it's a Monday.
Monday?
Yeah.
I can do noontime,
Oh, 12 to 5 again?
if that works for everybody.
Is it better to be mid-morning, like for?
Is it possible? Otherwise.
On Mondays, I have class to 10:30, so that's why I prefer the noon time, but, I mean, I can be late, like, to the meeting. I'm just afraid of quorums, that's all.
And we appreciate everyone being here so that we can establish quorum and get started on the meeting time.
Well, we can do 11 o'clock on Mondays, if that's a compromise.
11 to 4 on that day? 11 to 4? And we'll be back at the CDE that day, won't we? Although we love the accommodations here at the Chancellor's office, very nice to be meeting here. I think we'll be back at the Department of Ed.
Okay.
So if we have no more committee members with thoughts or reflections that they'd like to share, let's move on to what we're going to do next. And I'll ask Patricia, would you like to discuss the direction and topics for our next meeting?
Thank you, Chair Grande. Thank you so much for your feedback for this transition plan. It's very helpful for us going forward. And with regards to our next couple of meetings, I will say that I think that the emphasis has to be trying to firm up this transition plan so that it's, you know, approximates what you, and reflects your thoughts. So I can say that for the March 11th meeting, it will most likely be, I haven't even talked to my colleagues, but, you know, it will be focused on this transition plan. And then the April 22nd date as well. So I think that for the next couple of meetings that we have tentatively scheduled, it will be focused on this plan because that's what we need to be doing. We can certainly be receiving updates on our state programs, the CTE incentive grant program, as well as the K-12 component of the Strong Workforce program. But I think that it would behoove us to spend the time on this transition plan. I am unclear about people's availability for Monday the 22nd. So are we saying if we're going to do 11 to 4 on the 11th of March, are we also suggesting that is a good time for us on since it is a Monday?
The 22nd?
For April 22nd?
April?
April 22nd.
I will be in New York and not here.
Yeah, I think that there were a couple of folks that were unable to attend. Yeah.
I think that's spring break for the community colleges, is it not?
Yeah.
So will that,
We might have to get back with you on that.
Okay. All right.
so we might need to move that if there's there sounds like two conflicts
We'll have to
already.
get back to you folks then.
And there's a spring break, so.
It looks like we're going to have to get back to you on that
Okay.
one.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Well, folks, can you believe it? It's 3:57. Yeah. All of us were here, part of a robust conversation, and I want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank the Chancellor's Office for hosting us, and thank everyone who participated this afternoon for being in attendance. I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Our next meeting is scheduled for Monday, March 11th from 11 to 4 at the California Department of Education. It is now 3:58 and we're adjourned.
Thank you.